Hello everyone. In this video you will see a manhwa titled "The Broken Ring This Marriage Will Fail Anyway." Part 1 through 6. Please put a like and subscribe if you like this video. Your participation will help our channel. Thank you. In the description under the video there are time codes with which you can quickly switch to the right part of the video. Here we go.
Turned out my mission wasn't over.
One day, 17 years ago, she will have to marry the most handsome man in the world. When a 6-year-old girl pointed her finger at him holding that lifeless gaze, his life began to fall apart. She thought all noble families were the same, so the only thing that caught her eye was his face. The girl acted so eerily confident that his heart began to beat harder. Her name was Inés Valestena de Perez. She belonged to one of the highest-ranking families of the Grandes de Ortega, an alliance of 17 noble families to whom the emperor had granted peerage titles. And this girl was the one and only daughter of the Duke of Valestena and the one who rejected the Prince of the Empire and refused to be a princess. So revered and intelligent could have chosen any of the many suitors, but her choice fell on the heir of Escalante, and the reason was his beauty. Only he should not forget that she didn't like him at all. That's what she said at the time. And yet now, Inés was leaving him. But how could the young boy know how things would turn out? She had become his sunshine. And now it did not matter so much what sorrow might be hidden in her past or their future, but Carcel would stand here forever waiting for her. He longed for the girl to love him too, as he had loved her all along. A loud clattering was accompanied by the shouts of the heroine. She was asking Lord Carcel to stop, which she actually did. Without turning around, the man listened to her plea for help. The Countess was complaining of extreme dizziness. The girl's cheeks turned pink, but she dared not raise her eyes to him. The stranger girl did not know what to do, for there were only them, the weak ladies. Her hands were tense, as if she were embarrassed or afraid of something. According to her guesses, the Countess was only experiencing simple dizziness, which had happened before. She should have rested in silence for a while, but her residence was on the very outskirts of Mendoza. Suddenly, a shadow hovered over her, causing her to freeze. Lord Carcel smiled and silently watched her, while the girl became convinced of his beauty. He was the son of the greatest noble family in Ortega, and also the most attractive man in Mendoza. The guy called her his lady, causing her to burst out in embarrassment. The girl apologized, continuing to babble about how they weren't expecting a gentleman from whom they could seek help. But not a soul passed by, no matter how long they waited, which was why they were so greatly relieved when he appeared. 3 more female figures could be seen behind her, 2 of whom were supporting the girl who was feeling ill. The Lord put on a satisfied face, as this was indeed an urgent matter. She was honored to know that a gentleman like him was protecting the waters of the empire. The Countess, whom the man carried in his arms, had heard that his grandfather had devoted his life to the service of Ortega, and Lord Carcel had decided to follow in his footsteps. It was also rumored that he wanted to continue the noble work of his family. Upon hearing this, she was quite shocked. After all, the lad was the heir of the Escalante family, and the Nunara Sea was still a dangerous place where battles were fought. But Admiral Calderon's victory was enough to bring peace, but the pirates still caused so much trouble every year. The Lord, on the other hand, being a member of the Grandes de Ortega, had already learned that with his power came great responsibility. His grandfather had always told him that to hold an honorable position, it was necessary to have the willingness and acceptance of that responsibility. The Countess allowed herself to pounce upon him with a kiss, but the man did not respond to it. An alliance of 17 noble families, whom the Ortega imperial family had honored with titles of peerage. But even among them, the Escalante family was considered the best of the best. The heir was a man whose incredible looks were the envy of all. It was as if he was truly blessed by the Almighty. By the time he was 15, Lord Carcel was spending time in the company of all the ladies who had come of age. By 17, he was followed everywhere by admirers. And in 20, he began to get acquainted with more mature and insignificant women. His insatiability knew no bounds even in his youth. Carcel Escalante de Esposo, now aged 23, was in the prime of life. And even now, the lad decided to take advantage of the situation. After all, he hadn't signed up for this. However, it was hard to think about it now. Why had the Lord even agreed? After all, this woman was too easy. The Countess realized that it was about Carcel's fiancé. In her opinion, the girl was not good enough for him. Of course, she had roots in a noble family, and she belonged to the House of Valestena after all. Except that she always had such a bored and uninterested look about her. The Countess didn't understand how Ines could behave like that in front of such a perfect fiancé. It was as if Carcel had had an epiphany, for now he, too, thought it was too much. Being in the arms of this frivolous lady, the guy saw something interesting. Specifically, a girl with a blank stare. She was the one they were talking about. 17 years after the date of betrothal, Ines Valestena de Perez first became aware of his infidelity. Everyone looked at her and whispered, calling Ines a nun. In their eyes, the girl behaved too arrogantly in front of the other noble ladies, and all of them wished to tell Lord Carcel about it. Riding in his carriage, he made sure that she heard these words, and was just on his way to the residence of the Duke of Valestena. Once married, a man should not let any woman near him except his wife. However, the Lord already had so many women that he didn't care about that. The model of family life in high society, when adultery was not frowned upon, was long outdated, and adultery was forbidden, even after death. In that case, Carcel planned to have a lot of fun before the wedding. At least since he was destined to spend his life as a monk, he wouldn't have any regrets, and all his dalliances would soon be behind him. The Lord stormed into the room where Ines was sitting. He had no other choice. The girl nodded in greeting, assuming the man had a reason to see her. Even the servants could sense the tense atmosphere. In fact, he had wanted to meet not only yesterday but 3 days ago as well as 2 weeks ago. Ines explained that it was pouring like a bucket and she didn't want it to be a problem for him. It was an expected reaction after the scene that presented itself before Ines. But the girl had never ignored him like that before. Carcel understood how she felt that day, but mentally he still blamed her for the fact that he would have to live the rest of his life like a monk. However, Ines pretended not to understand what he was trying to say. She had changed his life with the flick of a finger, so to call this woman submissive would not turn his tongue. But Carcel felt that Ines Valestena loved him. She had chosen him for love, giving up the highest title and the legal right to marry a member of the imperial family. She had had plenty of opportunities to make things right, but she had missed them all. 17 years ago, or now, it doesn't matter, because the heroine waited out of love, still in the same place. But it has always been the problem. The girl had the feeling, yet Carcel didn't share it one bit, causing the guilt to constantly torment him. He wanted to explain everything, but Ines had seen it with her own eyes, so that was enough. And if she got it right, there was nothing scary about it. That was exactly what the man was surprised about. He became unlike himself, losing any confidence because the girl didn't even yell at him. Ines wasn't even upset, though. Carcel denied it, referring to the fact that she had refused to see him for 2 weeks. As it turned out, the girl didn't want that because of the rain, since her fiancé might get wet on the way here. Of course, she found such bickering very tiresome. They weren't close enough to have this kind of dialogue. And this was not about 1 or 2 women with whom Carcel had had an affair. Did he really think she didn't know about anything? Ines was not angry, as the Lord was free to be with whomever he wished. He couldn't get his head around it. After all, they were supposed to have a wedding soon. It didn't mean to her that they should lose their freedom right now, though. Moreover, they weren't married yet, so Ines would let him do as he pleased. The guy thought it was a joke, however. She wasn't saying all this because she was so understanding. The girl did not limit him in his actions because Karsel was indifferent to her. His heart began to pound frantically, which made that horrible sound in his ears. That summer, he turned 23. That's when she told him that everything he believed was a lie. As a little boy, Karsel asked how many years equaled life, which made everyone laugh. He was annoyed at this, until suddenly someone behind his back asked him if he knew the meaning of the word. It was Ines, who already recognized the answer. The kid was embarrassed, but still kept saying that he knew everything. The girl asked for an explanation, but he lowered his head and blanched. The little girl rushed sharply to the man whose full copy she was, and wanted to know if she really had to talk to this Lord Karsel. He, on the other hand, had sweat beading on his face, as if he were nervous. Ines was much smarter than her peers, and this she understood perfectly well. It was Duke Lenol Valestina. The man proceeded to moralize that the girl should not ignore those who were not as smart as she was. Karsel, on the other hand, seemed to think they thought he was a dullard. However, the girl didn't need friends, and besides, the Lord was her fiancé, not her friend. The Duke sighed heavily, trying to get the idea into her head that Ines should have been even kinder to him. But the girl was indeed bright, for she realized the badness of her character. But even so, she was still a lady. Ines turned sharply to Karsel, which made the boy shiver. She explained that only a dead man could answer how long life had been. The lad turned white altogether, deciding that dead people could talk. However, that was not the case. For that reason, none of the living knew the answer. The dead man knew it because he had gone through death. However, Karsel had learned of it about 4 months ago. Life was the time they had before death. So when a person died, it would end. Even so, the Lord could count and know how long his life would last. The lad wallowed in his world of thoughts, wondering how he would die. His grandfather's leg began to corrode after he was shot in Nunera. Did that mean he would lose his leg too or something? Ines mumbled that his grandfather had lived over a decade since he lost his leg. Now Karsel was confused at all. He was afraid that he would have to share the same fate, and if not, then he would have to marry her. His marks were dripping off his red face, but even so, the guy was awfully cute. Everyone was bantering and trying to figure out what had happened, while Ines freaked him out more by mentioning that they would have to make a baby as well. The truth was that it might not last a lifetime. A smile lit up her face at that phrase. She was talking about their marriage. And now they could raise their glasses to Karsel Escalante de Esposa and Ines Valestina de Perez, who would be married upon reaching adulthood. Thanks to this beautiful couple that has been together all their lives, the union between the two families will only be strengthened. Ines will become the lady of the Escalante family, and Karsel will become the son-in-law of the Valestina family, and to the joy of the imperial family, they will devote themselves to each other for the rest of their lives. It was from that day on that his life began to fall apart. Someone still couldn't understand why it was him. It was Oscar Valenza de Ortega, crown prince and cousin of Karsel. The guy looked at the little guy who didn't understand anything. Oscar asked Escalante to strain his meanderings and try harder. When he grew up and became emperor, would Karsel also stare at him in response to his question? It seemed to him that the Lord had done something to Lady Valestina, even though he was only 6 years old. That was what it was all about. How dare a 6-year-old cousin be so devious? He'd only just turned 10 himself. Oscar called the girl his. He couldn't accept that Karsel had dared to steal his master's property. The boy sizzled him with his angry gaze. Oscar would not punish him, however, since the Lord was his uncle's son, but it was assumed that their alliance would be for the good of the imperial family. When Ines refused the crown prince's offer and chose Karsel instead, it was Empress Cayetana who brought him to the girl, as if she had been waiting for it. She never once asked the little girl why she had defiantly refused the emperor's cheese. On the contrary, in letters the woman kindly persuaded her to make her own choice. Cayetana was supposed to maintain an alliance with House Valestina, but she certainly did not favor the sullen girl. The Empress needed Ines, but did not believe she was worthy of her son. Oscar knew she had turned him down and chosen a fool like Carcel, though the Lord himself thought the Crown Prince liked the girl. He wanted her so much. The guy called Ines a crow and laughed, since the desire to possess and sympathy are two different things. Oscar wanted to marry her, but that didn't mean he loved her. It just so happened that her bloodline was best suited for marriage. Either way, he wanted to visit this crow. There was still plenty of time before they would grow up. And when the meeting took place, Oscar was brimming with pomp and cunning, and in contrast, Carcel was devastated. In fact, it seemed to him that the girl hated the Crown Prince with all her soul, which Oscar was immediately able to sense. He definitely had a knack for picking up negative energy. Ines explained that it was customary to give at least a week's notice of a visit, but it seemed that His Highness had considered a visit to her estate such an extraordinary convenience that he had left proper etiquette unheeded, and as a result they had failed to receive her as befitted. Oscar had said that an apology between them was unnecessary. However, she was still not prepared for the visit, much to her embarrassment. The Crown Prince shot his eyes up, repeating that there was no need to prepare anything. He didn't come to see the Duke or Duchess but her. The kid didn't seem to catch on to what she was talking about at all. Ines thought the meeting would have gone much better if the time had been right. Carcel wondered how he could ignore her words so much. His Highness wanted to chat about the book she had provided, which he had reread a few days ago. His love for books was a serious problem for him, as he lacked time at times to learn how to run the empire. Ines decided that she should not have advised him about the book. Oscar, on the other hand, said it was nonsense because discussing these informative topics with her was always one pleasure. After all, the existence of intellectuals like them can be so lonely. They forever have to put up with the ignorance of the masses. What he was saying was truly ridiculous. However, whenever Oscar saw Ines, he felt like he could finally breathe. Most likely, Carcel had yet to experience the pain experienced by people like them. The Crown Prince had told her that it would be hard for a girl to meet someone of equal intelligence other than himself, so there was no risk involved. He gave her the chance to make the right decision. In the name of the imperial family, Ortega Oscar asked her to marry him. However, she didn't like the guy one bit. These words made him freeze as he continued to listen. It was for this reason that she refused him. He was overwhelmed by the anger that was accumulating in his clenched fists. Oscar wanted to know the reason, but suddenly Ines asked Carcel to come to her because he was her fiancé and therefore had to protect her. However, the Crown Prince did not want his intervention. The heroine continued to talk to the Lord, alluding to the inconvenience the Crown Prince had caused her. Oscar, on the other hand, believed that this had nothing to do with the children, since the negotiations were conducted by adults. But he did not consider the fact that Lady Ines was 6 years old. However, she was nothing like Carcel. The guy made a spectacle of the difference between want and like, but he did seem to like the girl. The little girl hid behind her fiancé's back, which caused a violent reaction from both of them. Now Oscar guessed what kind of game his cousin was thinking about. The Crown Prince thought the Lord intended to disrespect him. He had warned him, after all. He wanted to believe that Ines didn't mean it, as if she found herself unworthy, for the lad would one day rule an entire empire. However, Ines had heard enough. His Highness would not give up, for he wished she would endow him with wings, and then they would both rule Ortega. His shouts gave her a headache, but Carcel still continued to stand in a stupor. The boy wished he could stop this torment because he no longer wanted to come between them. Except, as Ines had prompted him, Carcel was only 6 years old, so he didn't have a master yet. Probably that was the impetus to take her by the hand and drag her away. The children ran out of the room, but when he inquired if her headache had gone away, the heroine explained that it was an obvious lie. Carcel remained in prostration, for it now seemed to him that Ines had no fear of death and had therefore lied to the Crown Prince. However, even the imperial family would not dishonor itself by reprimanding the house of Valistena on such an occasion. The Lord had no idea why his cousin liked such a girl. She was a brute, not even in appearance. Maybe a little Ines was cute, but even so, he was too good for her. The heroine took a rag and wiped Escalante's hands, making him as red as a tomato. 3 minutes later, he felt like he had been treated like a fool. Kersel noticed that she had not previously called him Escalante. As it turned out, Ines thought he hated her. However, that was not the case. But then why was the Lord crying? He had roared again when the girl had said they would have to live together until death do them part, and how Kersel had cried after her words about having a child. Now the boy was begging her to stop. He didn't understand the reason he was so embarrassed. Ines had agreed to call him by his first name. He'd never had anyone treat him like that in his entire life. She was the only one. Kersel, on the other hand, thought she was strange. After all, Ines liked him. At least that was what they said. But if it were true, she wouldn't have acted that way with him. The boy doubted her sincerity, but otherwise the heroine would not have dared to marry him. Rumors swarmed around Ines, according to which she did not understand that to choose Prince was the greatest honor, and that the girl pointed to Kersel because of his pretty face. However, that was the case. She didn't even deny it. The lad was even numb, as if he dreaded it. But would there be anyone who wouldn't like anything cute? Especially when the face could be put to good use. Those words indicated to him what Ines' opinion of people was. She said she liked him, and yet she was so rude. Didn't she want to impress him? The heroine didn't think long, as she didn't think she lacked anything to do so. However, Ines didn't agree with the idea that in order for someone to like you, you have to change yourself. Her confidence was reflected even in her posture. Kersel didn't have to like her at all. She didn't need to be, but he would only have to remember that she liked him very, very much. And now, as an adult, the heroine was saying that she wasn't interested in Escalante. That's when he realized that there was something wrong here. The guy wondered, had her feelings for him really changed? She had always been rather modest, and therefore, if she expressed affection, it was through letters, but her devotion had long been known to the whole of high society. Even this room was still the same. Nothing had changed in all the years. But there was something here, and Kersel was convinced of it. Something that could explain the change in her feelings. If I may say so, it's a clue. Was it possible that the reason was that she was uncomfortable because their bodies had changed? Or did it all happen before he entered the military academy? No. Even when disapproving looks were thrown at Ines, she always acted so coldly. At least she had stopped calling him Lord like she had last time. But something in this room had clearly changed. Not even that shapeless funeral dress could hide the fact that her body's newfound maturity was beautiful. The girl noticed that he was thinking about obscenities again, though for him, that would be his only pleasure. Kersel asked why she was not interested in him, but there was no hidden meaning here, so he could care less. Clearly, that wasn't the best answer. Ines explained that she had only given it to make him feel better. She said that she knew all about his personal adventures, that he didn't need to worry about her, and so Kersel was free to do whatever he wanted. It all made sense now. He had upset her, and that was why his fiancé was being so sarcastic, even though she had no idea what Kersel was talking about. Lord tried to explain that either that was the case, or she had said those words without actually putting that meaning in. It even seemed to him that Ines was concerned about his feelings. The guy himself didn't realize he was talking nonsense. He acted as if the girl had found another man or something like that. Kersel even asked if that was the case, and the answer was not unequivocal. Ines was nobody's desired quiet girl, just as his cousin had once said, the crow of the house of Valistena. However, the reason men hovered around her was because she already had an extremely attractive fiancé. Ines always dressed similarly, so it was no wonder she remained in the shadows. In a sea of lively birds, the heroine stood out like a crow, but with a body like that, she could win over even the silliest nobleman. But the truth is what she is. Carcel couldn't say that Ines was beautiful just because of her body. The girl declared that women were interested in him because her looks were much less threatening compared to his. She had no complaints about this marriage or him. Nor was there any point in ruining their relationship over such nonsense. He was born to be her husband. It seemed to the man that she was not all right in her mind, though Ines was more than sane. She knew exactly what jealousy was like, and she also knew how to be angry, as well as how to feel affection. That's why the heroine threatened to kill him if he betrayed her. That was what her love for the man made her, and for that reason she didn't want to waste her energy on someone like him. Someone she didn't even like. There was something else Carcel wished to say to her, but she had had enough. He grabbed her arm insolently, demanding that she listen to him. Ines continued to refuse, causing his anger and irritation to grow, though the Lord himself didn't understand why he was doing this, or why he was holding her wrist. And how had things gotten so dramatic? Tears began to stream down her face. What was she supposed to think? How was she supposed to understand his relationship with that woman? Carcel froze like a stone, repeating her words in his head. What really surprised him was the expression on his fiancé's face. He put his arm around her shoulders, reassuring her that nothing had happened between them. That couldn't be true. The man pulled her against him, holding deep eye contact and calling her the only one who mattered to him. Carcel himself couldn't believe he had said it. Ines continued to cry, forcing herself not to believe his words. His strong arms pushed her body against his until they both felt something. The heroine pulled away sharply, trying to break free from his tenacious grasp. She was not willing to take any more of these insults. Now in her eyes the groom was horrible and disgusting. But even now this lecher kept her close to him. How it hurt him. Ines switched to abusive language, but according to him, his body wouldn't have reacted that way if there had been another in his arms. She was the only one that caused such a reaction in him. Now there was a need to end it all. Carcel had told her his secret. He felt this way only toward her. There was a long silence in the room. The man mentioned that he would let her go if she trusted him. In that case, what could Ines do? Her dark curls flowed down her narrow shoulders, which became bare in an instant. Lord had only to show how much he desired her. The girl never wore underwear when she went to meet him, each time hoping that one day he would take her into his arms and get to know her body more intimately. She had waited so long for this, that it seemed like a dream now. Just a harmless dream without suffering or sorrow. A dream in which Ines is exposed, and so he would never want to wake up from it. Except, it all turned out to be fiction. He was awakened by his little copy, which reminded his brother of sparring. The man thought back to her words. Now he was convinced he could live the life he wanted to live, because his fiancée didn't care one bit. And come to think of it, Carcel also blamed her for today's incident. In fact, the Lord was even glad that it came out this way, and he seemed to have become the happiest person in the world. The captain, as he was addressed, had been repeating the same words since his arrival, constantly referring to his chastity. The man had simply never heard Carcel speak so much, which meant he was satisfied with what she had told him. He should have made for a long tongue, however, because the bullet was moving very fast. He didn't even know how to shoot properly, and he was already criticizing his captain. In fact, the guy envied the Lord. That is, it was every man's dream, namely, a wife who didn't restrain her husband. When a man gets married, he will be forced to live under the constant supervision of his partner. That's when they cease to be free. Did he really think Carcel was such a scumbag? All the man said was that he was lucky to have as a bride such a caring and kind lady who was willing to let her husband live the life he wanted. Except that, in the Lord's own opinion, this woman showed no care for him. In fact, Ines didn't give a damn about him. That is why she will be fine whatever Carcel does. Once again, the captain was approached by a lady who was only too glad for his long vacation. She was thrilled to be able to watch him all summer. God had endowed Carcel with a beautiful face and such a strong and perfect body, which made the girl envy his bride. And only he was able to turn her on like that. For some reason, the man froze and suddenly asked this lady to move away from him. Of course, she objected, because this night he was to be hers, but the Lord still left her alone. There was some nonsense going on in his head. Escalante had thought that those speeches were more than just nonsense, but now he had doubts. The words spoken in his dream had no power over him, so why was this happening? Why didn't Carcel get excited being with such a lady? After the wedding, he wouldn't have any other options besides Ines, so he shouldn't be deprived of doing this. It must be some kind of curse, or maybe it's just a temporary malfunction. Lord believed that he had zero chance at that age of fitting in as impotent. Now he tried to reassure himself. But that very night, as soon as he thought of Ines, the problem resolved itself. That's how his self-belief worked. It was all right, because Ines wouldn't have to go tonight anyway. How wrong Carcel had been. The bride apologized for being late, but the man was at a loss for words. The girl practically did not show up at such events, even despite the invitations. While everyone was whispering about her, Ines knew that her fiancé would show up here. Her bare hand touched his tense cheek. She asked him not to make such a facial expression, which was devoid of any nobility, in public. Who was responsible for it, though? An awkwardness hung between them. The silence was interrupted by the heroine, who apologized for the incident. She wasn't quite sure she knew the reason, but it seemed that what had happened had thrown him off balance a bit. Had Ines really come here to see him at a different time? Though the girl didn't think a separate reason was necessary for a simple meeting. Had she upset him again? Her excessive politeness was unnecessary, for Carcel found it both an inconvenience and a cause for concern. Ines leaned closer, sensing how irritable he was today. Such proximity made the man flush and blush, but she noticed that, as of late, the Lord had been acting awfully strange. By the time Carcel came to his senses, he was already in the carriage. It even seemed to his fiancée that the guy was somehow unhinged. However, the Lord himself did not understand why he behaved like that. After all, he did not consider himself some kind of pervert or a teenager with raging hormones. Ines even suggested that he get out of the carriage if he came to his senses, especially when they were already at his house. The girl made a displeased look on her face as she mentioned that they were going to the Escalantes' residence. The need to see her was not something that pleased him too much. The heroine understood that, but if her fiancé continued to behave like this, it would turn into a problem for her as well. But she was well aware that he didn't think she was annoying. Carcel helped her out of the carriage, after which Ines leaned on his arm, which was a very painful torture for him. He sat her down across from him, which made her feel the space was too open for conversation. They had something personal to discuss, but the man felt this room was private enough so they could begin. The last time Carcel had left in such a hurry that it had not been possible to finish the conversation there, though he himself had denied it. Ines appreciated the effort her fiancé had made to hide the truth from her. In particular, she spoke of his efforts to keep his salacious lifestyle a secret. She knew he was doing it out of respect for her. Carcel had decided to keep his mouth shut, since the blame was on him. He was now convinced that the bride was crazy about him, except she wasn't done yet. What the heroine meant was that he didn't need to worry and hide who he was dating because she had no interest in him. Just like he had no interest in her. For the remainder of the engagement, they can just keep it that way and stay out of each other's personal lives and then stick to that after the wedding. As long as no one disrespects the other outright, they will indulge each other and stay out of personal matters. Carcel tried to make sure that what he heard was correct, and as if asking for permission to do whatever he wanted on his own time. As if the girl intended to do something behind his back, he jumped up and moved closer to her, sitting down on the table. Ines reminded him that people don't behave that way. However, the guy defiantly replied that he wouldn't be a toad by sitting on the table. Carcel explained that before calling him a child, then she should have thought about what nonsense she was talking about. It appeared that Ines had put on this whole show for the sake of her lover. He asked her that question again, for it would explain everything. Why she didn't care about his misdeeds, why she let him do whatever he wanted, and why she went so far. Who knows, it might have been more than one man. Escalante couldn't imagine how many men the main character could seduce with her porcelain skin and sensual body. Given her personality and the way she commanded, the girl could definitely take control of anyone. But after the wedding, Ines refuted his speculation. The only reason she suggested it was to make things easier for him. She wanted the groom to be free. After all, his life had changed because of her. Carcel had got engaged to her without wanting it to. He had to become heir to the house again because of her. They should have gotten married 6 more years ago, but Carcel had enrolled in the military academy, only to postpone the wedding. By doing so, though, he'd only done her a favor. It wasn't that Ines hated him, it was just that it hurt to postpone the wedding. She was sure it meant nothing to him. It was that phrase that caused him to have an internal contradiction. In her eyes, Carcel boarded a warship and went into battle only to postpone a life together with his nun-like fiancé. There was no point. His heart began to beat rapidly, for there definitely had to be some ulterior motive here. Over the past 17 years, the man had seen her from all sides, but she was only going to be his wife, in fact, going to lead her life apart from him. Carcel practically nestled into her face, looking into her eyes, summarizing all of her words. Did she really think that was possible? Escalante reached up to kiss her, causing her hands to shake. Hadn't the girl said they should have children? What about sharing in the process of conceiving them? He was sorry to ruin her plans, but they would not live apart. She would have to kiss him hundreds of times, and their bodies would meet thousands of times. Carcel had promised not to lay a finger on any other woman, being by her side when she gave birth to their firstborn and then the next. And even if they don't make babies, he will make sure that he will satisfy her. He would make sure his wife would do the opposite, because he didn't want his so-called freedom or privacy. His understanding of marriage ruled that out. Even though Carcel thought he was a disgusting bastard, even so he was more faithful than Ines. The story of the heroine herself was different from her point of view. Dana's first life was cut short when she was 26 years old. The length of life was known only to the dead, which was how she came to know the length of her own. The girl knew the answer as she had died before, but the source of the knowledge she gained was not only death. After all, the end of her first life was 26 years. It was the result of her own decisions, and no one else's. It had also happened a long time ago, but the sense of hopelessness experienced then was still fresh in her mind. She remembered the last thing she had seen was the dorky look on the prince's face, and the chaos that had ensued at 26. The one and only daughter of the Duke of Valestana had achieved her status by belonging to the Grandes de Ortega. She was born into one of the strongest families in the empire and was a lady who enjoyed extravagant jewelry. For the sake of satisfying his daughter's fine tastes, the Duke spared no expense, and this led to Ines becoming a permanent leader in fashion in the city of Mendoza. At the time, noble women applied an almost poisonous powder to their skin on a regular basis to make it pale. But soon after the heroine returned from a summer trip with skin the shade of bronze, tanning gained popularity. Ines truly lived a social life. Magazines were busy weekly glorifying the Crown Prince's bride for her dignity. She was beloved by the Crown Prince and lived like a beautiful young princess. At that time, Ines was so happy in her perfect life that she made an effort to make it even more perfect. The girl exhausted her dressmakers to create new dresses and studied a lot of invitations to decide which events would not only improve her reputation, but also allow her to become the center of attention. In pursuit of a slim waist, Ines starved herself, but wanted those around her to believe that she was born that way. so she made a spectacle of eating large portions of food when attending formal dinners. Afterward, however, the heroine was nausea-inducing. Was she living a normal life? Ines wasn't sure about that. That's when doubts began to grow in her. She couldn't tell if it was for the sake of becoming the perfect wife, or if she was simply using him to gain that. But Ines did love him. Loved him, even if it had only been a few years, and the girl had fallen for his vile lies. And the reasons for her love were rooted in her own vanity, and she really loved reputation and status. How could it be love? How could she have this light feeling for someone like him? The girl had suffered 4 miscarriages, and whenever she lost a child, the imperial family and the empress blamed her for it, exercising scorn and attacks. This is how Ines lived for 10 years. Oscar never once took her side and ignored her pleas for comfort. In fact, he even came to the conclusion that his wife had been born into the world with a cursed womb. Although her life seemed dazzling from the outside, the protagonist was dying inside. After marriage, it was hard to call her life normal. As a result, when Ines found out that her not one bit spoiled spouse had contracted every possible disease due to his promiscuous lifestyle, and that it was the cause of death of all 4 children. When she was tormented by the memories of all those horrible nights when her vile husband had taken her, pregnant, by force, ignoring her attempt to refuse him, solely to satisfy himself. He was the only man she'd ever known, and now her body was tainted with proof of all the lewd nights Oscar had spent with other women. Ines had done nothing shameful in her life, but she was still being punished for marrying a human likeness, a freak. But there was something worse than the illnesses he endured, his desire to. He was well aware of this, but he had never once hesitated to satisfy himself at the expense of his unassuming wife. Whether it was his wife or the conception of an heir was of no concern to him. He didn't even do it to annoy her. Oscar simply didn't give it a second thought. When Ines looked back on her life, she counted 4 miscarriages as a blessing. If even one baby struck out, the sin would be irreversible. Her mind had never been clearer. The fact that she had not produced a single child was her only consolation. Oscar had said that no one in his lineage had ever been divorced before, that he couldn't be the first loser in the imperial family. So now she is going to change that. He was going to be the very first prince to drive his wife to suicide. Ines was going to do it because living with him made her disgusted. And she couldn't spend another minute with someone like him. Just like that, the heroine left a bloody mark on his life. No one could have come up with a more peaceful outcome, for her death did not cause harm to a single soul, not even the crown prince, who was little better than a drain rat. If he had suffered from anything, it was Ines' will, in which she had revealed all the details of his sordid sexual escapades. She didn't expect to receive any compensation. She just hoped that if there was a God, she'd be lucky enough to be in a better place. And on that, the protagonist closed her eyes, determining for herself that it wouldn't change her mind. And so, waking up on the hunting grounds where she spent her childhood, Ines had no idea what had happened. She shifted to a run, breathing in the fresh air and looking around the green expanse as the wind played with her dark hair. The boy, an exact replica of her, didn't understand what had gotten into her. Ines, on the other hand, was crying because she felt the pain. This was her dream. He was still so young. Who would have thought that the great Luciano Valestine was a brat in his 19 years? The heroine's older brother looked back at her warily as she did it again. The girl was acting very strange today. Perhaps Ines had mistakenly taken her mother's medicine, although the servants thought that the reason was because of the upcoming wedding. Luciano agreed with this position, except that Ines herself said that she could not wait for this event. Juana was also young and beautiful in her eyes. She had just turned 17 this year. Her brother tried to stop her, for she sounded like a perverted old man lusting after young girls. Her whole life at Perez, ended when she turned 16, the moment he threw the veil over her head. From then on, Ines couldn't go back for the rest of her life. And those who were dear to her, the beautiful garden where she played with Luciano, and that place at the top of the castle, all became a memory. Ines had no idea how things were here, how the people she had left behind had changed. But now it all appeared before her again, just as it had before. All of last spring, the heroine spent here in Perez. That was 10 years ago. Still, that time of year in Balistan. And now she was realizing that spring wasn't over yet. Luciano announced that in 4 months, she would be married to the crown prince, and in 2 weeks the girl would be leaving for Mendoza. Everyone in this place will be looking for faults in her. After all, Prince Oscar was already too good for her. Her brother understood that her sister was feeling the pressure, however. Ines interrogated him about who else was too good for whom. It was like she was having a tantrum. The girl jumped on Luciano and started hitting him. It all seemed too true to be real. But at her 26, the protagonist's life was already so hopeless. She had been naive at 16 when she dreamed of being Oscar's wife, but none of it was a dream. Ines went back to the time when she was 16, and the wedding was 4 months away. So her life hadn't fallen apart yet. She was rewarded for her patience. This was her chance to kill herself properly before she could go to heaven. At least that was what Ines had piously believed at the time, back then when she had first experienced death. They had been engaged for 10 years and the wedding was just around the corner, so the girl knew what kind of reaction to expect. At that moment, Oscar was practically a saint, cold to the mind and sober of mind. He was the crown prince for keeping his chastity to share it with his bride on their wedding night. Who would believe it if the main character told him that 2 years later, he would be frequenting brothels? And he'd be infected with venereal disease. There was no need to waste this precious opportunity on a futile struggle. Ines didn't want to marry Oscar again. And to prevent that from happening, she should have been more cunning. There were rumors that the mistress was in love with a portrait painter. But she was underage, and the man was extremely handsome. So what happened to the woman who had obediently agreed to such an honorable marriage and stayed with him? She felt that love could overshadow a failed marriage in her first life. And when true love burst into her life, the heroine was swept up in it in an instant. It was this man who showered her with compliments while lying beneath her. From the moment he first saw her, he always knew he would be helpless. He would never be able to stop falling in love with her, making even tears run down his face. His name was Emiliano. The 16-year-old girl had disappeared from Perez with him, and even though they were penniless, she had lived a happy life together for 4 years, until her older brother found them. Emiliano managed to escape for a while with the help of another man, but it ended with him returning on his own 2 feet to die in front of her. The Duke of Valestena's daughter had run away with that poor man, only to return as a child. It was a shame, but fortunately, the Empress was so merciful. Luciano should have kept a close eye on her. They had to make sure her wedding to the Count Almenara went smoothly. And as for the offspring she gave birth to, they wanted to get rid of him. And the older brother promised to take care of him. Ines, all the while eavesdropping on this, didn't want her child to feel pain in a strange place. Sometimes one single name could change the whole world. His name was Emiliano. He was the only color in her world that consisted of only black and white. Now she begged him not to forget her. The man who had changed her world could no longer exist in it. It was a perfectly thought-out plan. The protagonist had even chosen a handsome man to marry so that he would cheat on her. All of this was done in order to become the wife of Duke Escalante, who by chance does not live with him. Carcel considered himself more faithful than her, and therefore the guy would never betray his own family. In real life, Ines pondered whether she had done something wrong. What mistake had she made? Her plan had been 17 years in the making, so it couldn't just fall apart. Then why was Carcel betraying her? At last, this lady's man had decided to settle down. Yesterday, he even sent a letter asking for Madam's hand in marriage. Only it was his desire that was the problem. Juana didn't quite understand her train of thought, but the lieutenant was perfect. He was only guilty of being a womanizer, but he had made a promise to work on his behavior. However, Ines had heard it 1,000 times, and she didn't want to hear it from him. In her youth, the heroine had had tender feelings for this man, but now she didn't even want to hear it, and she didn't even want to hear it, and she didn't have much oil on her feet at all. Her mistress hated having it on her feet. Juana noticed that this was the first time she had ever done this for her, so how could she know? Ines abruptly changed the subject, admitting that she was fond of the current Escalante. The girl even suggested that her mistress enjoyed watching him flirt with other women. And that look? Her fiancé had said he didn't need it. Perhaps he had said a phrase or two to placate her before the wedding. But still, he was a soldier, so he was unlikely to make such statements so easily. Ines, on the other hand, thought that everyone was lying. Soldiers lie to their superiors all the time. Even the priests in whom Juana had such faith must have lied from time to time. But she was right about one thing. After all, Escalante had only said such a thing to please her. He was simply weaving what he could. Carcel could never change. A feline can't suddenly become a man. If a dog says how he'll turn human tomorrow, will he? The lady was talking to herself again. Ines was not wrong, so her efforts would not be in vain. Someone had gotten all the information. Why did he always act so suspicious? Carcel pushed him away when the man talked about confidential information. Ines really didn't have anyone. The lady was well known for her decency and chastity, which was why the cat had told him there was no way she had a man. And according to the mouse, her position allowed her to keep an eye on all the private visitors to the Valestina family residence, and she told Escalante's head was already boiling with these nicknames. But still he wondered who this man was. Carcel only wanted to know his identity, and perhaps, if possible, to see him in person. The girl wore a mask of indifference, as if she wouldn't shed a drop of blood if she hurt herself, but he wondered if she had ever shown a bright smile to anyone else. The lady's reputation was impeccable, from her demeanor to her way of being, perfect in everything. Except the speaker had gotten this information from people belonging to her family. As it became known, the surveillance was his first time, as well as the lieutenant's. What he was doing, Carcel couldn't believe it himself. As it was, he already felt that he had committed almost the crime of the century by ordering his subordinate to spy on his fiancée. Of course, at the end of this pathetic enterprise, his subordinate had gotten the information much more quickly than he had anticipated. But as expected, it was nothing special. And the answer was obvious. So why did the protagonist feel relieved? Is it possible that his fiancée is just incredibly meticulous? Jose heard all the maids laughing at the idea. They said she saw men as gnats. Moreover, the man had asked around, but no one had said anything to cause concern. Yes, and it was as if the women Carcel had met in the past had made their own checks on the lady, hoping to find her weak spot. For some reason, the maids seemed to be no strangers to answering such questions. Jose had no idea how often those ladies had been questioned, since his investigation hadn't aroused suspicion. But Ines Valestina had unfriended his very nature. The man had no idea that such a thing could be going on behind his back. These women were looking for flaws in his fiancée, whom he didn't even love, planned to use it against her. Who to blame but himself? It's his face. But it won't happen again, Josie wondered, if the lieutenant had sent back the letter of request for marriage. But what would he do if there was a weakness? The lad decided that the gentleman intended to break the engagement. But a promise is a promise, especially when marriage was involved. Carcel exhaled and explained that he would not consider it a bad thing if she had a man. After all, he had had many women himself, It would be unreasonable of him to say that he couldn't get married because he suspected his fiancée of having affairs on the side. In addition, whether he wanted the marriage or not, from the age of 6 until now, the man had never once considered a life in which he was not married to Ines. Carcel intended to return to Calsdale after the wedding, which would take place within the next 2 weeks. It was the longest vacation he could get this summer. Jose would also have to return, so he had to use up all of his vacation time, including winter vacation time. A dinner was held at the Valestena family residence, when the wedding was 10 days away. The Duke, on the other hand, sizzled Carcel with his gaze, as he had heard that he had kept a quiet lifestyle. Given that his antics were known all over Mendoza, he was a deaf man. Luciano was in agreement. How nervous Carcel was. He explained that he couldn't think clearly, which made the Duke think that the guy wasn't thinking at all. All this time he had assumed that Escalante was a simple traitor, but it seems that nature had deprived him of brains as well. If the lack of a benefactor was considered a talent, then he would definitely be the greatest genius. How could such a fool even consider himself worthy of his daughter's hand in marriage? Carcel, on the other hand, was covered with cold sweat. If he were to officially take Ines as his wife, he would do everything he could not to disappoint His Majesty. However, the man was disappointed by his mere presence. The heroine herself was silently observing the situation while sharing her meal. The Duke had been watching the lad all evening, and it gave him agony to see him breathing. Suddenly, Ines pounded on the table, demanding that everything stop, especially when her father himself had invited a guest. The Duke literally flamed at his daughter's reaction, which remained casual. Lionel could have easily cracked his skull open, but he didn't. He had even changed his plans to give him a proper dinner. Previously, the man had done nothing only because of his behavior. This small man just shouted that he was not going to take her as a wife. Rumor had it so, but in fact they were getting married, so Ines asked to leave Carcel alone. The boy himself could not believe that Ines' mother drank so much strong alcohol in such a situation. It seemed to her that no one had eaten much that evening, and she was the only one enjoying the meal. Lionel was even more angry when Carcel deigned to speak. He had not said a single flattering word to his future wife all evening. According to the Duke, Escalante could tell that she was especially beautiful tonight, that the dress paled in comparison to her beauty. It was for this reason that the Lord spoke sharply of the fact that Ines was already beautiful. The girl's father raged at the words of one who sold his body for a penny, for he would not tolerate his daughter being neglected. Before her years of youth were gone, they had decided to show up here with the intention of getting married before the 2 weeks were up. He had even gotten the idea that Carcel had caught a venereal disease and was about to give up, and now he was being told to get an heir. In his eyes, the boy was nothing to his daughter. Yes, and Ines couldn't take it anymore. She gave her father a cold stare, for it was not right to treat a guest like that. Lord Carcel was respected in the Imperial Navy and didn't trade his body or steal anything. Of course, there were plenty of flaws in him that one could criticize without distorting the truth. The Duke of Valestena had reason to do so. After all, his daughter was not getting any younger with the years. But the man still did not understand why she was bringing the marriage to an end. Her fiancé had denied the wedding plans and sailed the seas, so his anger was expected. But Carcel had no idea that Ines' family would oppose the marriage so strongly. That their engagement had not yet been broken off was astounding. What followed was a suggestion to hang on again. Now then, the Carcel understood why the Duke had never once objected while he kept finding excuses to delay the wedding. This was what he wanted. Ines was long past the age of consent in Ortega, and since she bore the surname of Valestena, there should have been no problem in receiving marriage proposals from other worthy families. This engagement existed to this day, not to mention that neither Valestena nor Escalante are ordinary noble families, so they didn't judge anything lightly. Even though Carcel might not like the girl, or even be interested in her, she at least wanted him. Today he realized something. Ines' smile was most beautiful when she was lying. That was why the girl had confessed her love for him in front of everyone. Her mother's opinion was different from the Duke's statement because she liked him originally. Ines, too, had always said that he was sickeningly good for her. Now, Carcel was getting annoyed when Miguel walked so close to Ines. Her mother was already drunk, but she still demanded his attention. She admitted that she wanted a daughter different from Ines. Decisively, all her actions brought disappointment. Clearly, she hadn't always been like this. The girl had changed when one day she came down with a terrible fever. Since then, she had been disappointing her with everything she did. Even now, the heroine looked like a witch. Would Carcel be able to bear living with her? The man himself, however, thought she was quite beautiful. Her mother saw that he resisted it, and therefore made every effort to postpone the wedding. Even the thought of it horrified him. She was hardly indignant either. The mother asked Carcel to change her own daughter, who, in her eyes, was suffering from illness. It was simply unbearable. She had the feeling that Ines was devoting the whole day to confusing her. It even seemed to her that the girl had exchanged her soul with someone else. Sometimes she was as evil as if she were possessed by a demon. When she was young, she had threatened her with self-mutilation. Though her mother had suggested that the girl only needed a makeover, that's all. Then she ignored her, and then the woman decided to teach her a lesson by knocking her out to put on better clothes. Even today, Ines stuffed her stomach with whatever she could find. What kind of noblewoman would behave like that? You couldn't say she wore makeup, and Carcel had seen her dressed with his own eyes. He couldn't believe his ears. A mother should help her daughter to be loved by her husband and not do anything to tarnish her reputation. But that day, Ines looked at her with such anger. From that moment on, her daughter's fate was no longer in her control, and so she entrusted her into the Lord's hands. Soon he would have to become her husband, and then the man would go to bed only with her. The woman began to laugh. For the one and only time Ines had managed to gain her approval was when she had made him hers by putting a chain around his neck while they were young. The Duchess was astonished, for they were only 6 years old at the time. It was when the Empress announced that Carcel would have to marry Ines that he sobbed with fear. Such a thing is not likely to be forgotten. And the girl was different. She knew exactly what she was doing. That's why her mother saw the devil in her. Ines asked her fiancé's forgiveness for her own father's behavior, but it was all right because the Lord himself was aware of his own shortcomings. The girl felt guilty, therefore she asked the man not to pay attention to the words said by Lionel. Nevertheless, he had already done so. Carcel had even set the date of their wedding without any notification. Now Ines would have to wear her mother's hideous 27-year-old dress. Of course, the lieutenant was only doing what he thought was right. Ines merely wished to marry him, so she had no objections. She had been waiting for him for a long time, so this would be accepted with a smile. The Lord, on the other hand, knew her thoughts were not pure, but he was too good to be bound by any conventions, especially since Ines didn't want to see him languish under the burden of rules and obligations. It was one thing to compare a grown man to a flower, but Ines seemed to be brainwashing him now. But why would she do that? In his eyes, she spoke in a manner as if she sought to control his mind. So what were her intentions? He had already kissed her, so he made himself very clear. The heroine explained that it was an effort to put a sense of duty in her head. Carcel was utterly outraged at the use of those words, as he had not pursued those goals. Ines said that she liked him, and afterwards stated the opposite. She said she didn't want to waste her powers, but she was actively pushing him to the edge of the cliff, as if she couldn't wait to get rid of him. Maybe Ines never liked the Lord at all, but hated him. The girl did not understand why he was so angry because it was Carcel who had made the choice in favor of a disorderly life. It seemed to her that the lad's inability to understand was the result of relying solely on his body and neglecting the gray matter. Even now, he was still an idiot with a pretty face. He never missed an opportunity to mention his attractiveness, but Carcel, on the contrary, considered it his advantage. Moreover, the man was not at all eager to participate in this engagement. In this case, Ines released him from his obligations, and he promised that after the wedding, everything would change. What made a man decide to turn into a saint? After all, they would even have separate rooms. The girl was not going to lie down with the dogs, but Escalante argued since animals had to live among humans. Once again, he did not want to be released into the wilderness. Their lips made contact, causing both of them to blush. Carcel pointed out to her not to waste her strength simply, especially since it was becoming too dangerous. He ended up getting a slap on the wrist. Ines remained adamant, expressing neither joy nor anger. However, the slap came not to Escalante's face, but to his head. It might even seem from the blow that it wasn't the first time for the heroine. The thought of it being his first time burdened her somewhat. He'd be surprised how many people existed who wanted to be spanked. Besides, dogs were supposed to run around outside according to their upbringing. Animals should never be allowed to go into their master's room, let alone Carcel's bed. Since the beginning was started by a man, Ines herself decided to set some boundaries. After that would come the main part. These were the very basics, without which there was no way around it. In her opinion, if the couple wanted to please their families, there was no need to hold back. In any case, their wedding was a joke, and she would be in an old dress for the ceremony. Oh, and Carcel was a man who was floundering around trying to avoid his bride. Given the circumstances, Ines would have said he might have found the situation funny. That, however, was a lie. After all, the Lord had always seen her as his wife, which was why he had kissed her. Carcel apologized for his rudeness and carelessness, promising not to do anything she wouldn't like. All she had to do was ask for it. Ines was visibly nervous. However, the man would assume she was fine with everything, except for the kissing. And so the time flew by, and finally the wedding day arrived. To the ringing of the bells, the wedding melody rang out at the ceremony. And waiting for Ines at the altar was Carcel, who was truly blown away by her appearance. The color white suited her. A long eye contact kept the man in his thoughts, until the couple took their vows and sealed their union with a kiss. A wedding ceremony imbued with an atmosphere of solemnity and piety to which only the imperial family and 17 noble families were invited. Let this event could not be called large-scale, but the participation in it was not regretted by any of the parties. For no matter what anyone said, the situation continued to remain quiet and calm. And everyone was stunned by the beauty of the heroine. Carcel was approached by Ihar, who noticed how the man did not take his eyes off the newlywed. The new man was known for his old-fashionedness, but in comparison to him, Escalante was a saint. Duke Valestena did his best to convey to him that there were enough other non-corrupt young men who could come to replace him as Ines' groom. Among them were Enrique Osorno, Leonardo Helves, and Ihar, who would never stray from the righteous path. At least he was considered so by others. Carcel was amused by the fact that he was actually one of the contenders, especially when the man had said rude things to the groom on his wedding day. However, Ihar only noted that they had made a mistake and would lose the bet, for now it was clear why Escalante couldn't take his eyes off Ines. He even had an idea that the guy would faint right in the middle of the ceremony. No one could believe their own eyes. Everyone thought that there was another daughter in the Valestina family that no one had ever heard of. Obviously, everyone was shocked. The girl kept getting a combination of surprised and admiring looks. She smiled good-naturedly at those who gazed at her in amazement, and she ignored those who caused annoyance. Her behavior was natural, and in high society, Ines had always lorded it over the other nobles. But she was still herself. There was just a change in her hair and attire. Despite this, the world treated her as if everything about her had changed. Ihir doubted that it would be enough for the groom to be satisfied with just her, for novelty could be intoxicating. Moreover, even her body looked different. It was unexpected luck for Carcel. However, the man himself denied it since he had already seen it. Ihar had promised not to interfere with the fun, especially since he had no power. When Escalante got bored of the candy bouquet period, however, the cheeky man would wish to comfort his spouse. Even though they had seen it for themselves, they still couldn't believe that the woman dancing with Lieutenant Escalante was really the Ines Valestina they all knew. Carcel, however, told Ihar that if he came to the conclusion that he was bored with life, Ihar would simply have to tell the lieutenant, who would be more than happy to interrupt her. One way or the other, women grazed around him, which made it seem unfair to his interlocutor. The man was getting everything he wanted, and why couldn't he expect Ines to stay at home obediently? Besides, if the heroine finds a lover, it will be much easier for Carcel to get rid of the eating guilt to the woman who has been in love with him since he was 6 years old. And there were many like Ihar. Escalante was approached by his cousin, who was chatting about the Valestina family's finest wine. He had previously been unable to refuse a single bottle, even despite his pleas, but it seemed it was because of Carcel, who had become his brother-in-law, that they had to part ways after all. Oscar would have been easier to admit if the girl had favored Enrique Osorno. However, why did she choose Escalante? Even now, they looked great together. After all, as expected, Ines was gorgeous beyond belief. But what could an unmarried man like the Crown Prince know about marriage? He was having fun, after all, as his spouse was now having fun with another man. Oscar was already 27. Even after being rejected by Ines at the young age of 9, he had secretly continued his fruitless attempts at courting her. Eventually, it ended with him betrothed to the niece of the Marquis Barca, who was now coming out of the marriageable age, for Ines had turned 22. The prince refused to marry, citing her youth. He had only a few words with Ines, and the reason for this was simply that the refusal was too emphatic. So now, the Crown Prince was constantly egging Carcel on to make him feel the same way, though during their first dance, the main character's smile was quite normal. However, Oscar thought it was fake. This probably provoked Escalante, who drank from his wife's glass, which was unacceptable even for a prince. Suddenly, the talk was about Ihar, who, according to Oscar, will become bald like his father. However, he even gave Carcel advice, and yes, to watch out for himself. The man joked that his interlocutor had a forehead like his father's, which made the Crown Prince very angry. Now he was curious if having the same shape meant that both of them would end up with similar hairlines. After a while, Ines felt hungry, but Juana had forbidden her to eat as she might have a potbelly during her wedding night. If only that were the point. She'd had time to sample enough viands at the banquet. Even the Duchess had taken a look at her, but she wouldn't be able to kill her daughter because she was now Escalante. The girl had changed so much. She had always said before that even socializing with other nobles was to her liking. Juana was talking about how everyone in the hall bulged their eyes at the lady, as if they wanted a date with her. The Duke and Duchess were happy at first, but became more concerned afterward. They even wanted to hand out numbers to the men in line. Ines thought that they were not interested in her, but in the art created by Juana's hands. The girl believed that her lady was always beautiful. People themselves were limited, especially young men. They even flirted with her openly, and the señoritas began to behave so friendly with the protagonist. Once upon a time, Ines too was limited even to a greater extent than them, although Juana didn't remember such a thing. Anyway, it could have been better because the girl didn't wear a single custom-made dress. Ines, on the other hand, wanted to maintain the easy atmosphere of the wedding. She'd never had the chance to take part in one after her first life, but even this small sample was enough to exhaust her. When the heroine was living that life, Every day was a pathetic attempt to survive, even if it seemed like a laughing matter at the time. But anger and despair were no laughing matter. Though now those memories had become rather hazy, one night had made them all worth it. But now, Ines was all too aware of the situation she was in. She couldn't allow Carcel to be humiliated or looked down upon. After all, it was his first wedding. Throughout the marriage, Ines would not harm him in any way, nor would she shy away from her duties as a wife. The girl would not give him a single reason for divorce, and the rest of her plan should go off without a hitch. Now she was going to go to the bedroom. After all, this was just the beginning. The wedding ceremony and banquet were held solely for the amusement of others. The conclusion of the actual marriage contract, however, was coming to a close on the wedding night. In the aristocratic world, if nothing was accomplished on that very night, the next day the marriage could be simply annulled, as if it had never taken place. And yet even a fully consummated marriage can turn into nothing if I do not comply with the conditions imposed by each of the parties. Of course, it didn't happen very often. All they wanted was for the wedding night to go smoothly. Besides, Carcel said that Ines still wanted this marriage. The Duke of Valestena kept threatening to annul it if any kind of interference arose, but was unable to realize this as long as his daughter wanted to keep the marriage alive. She tormented the bridegroom both in dreams and in reality, and his wishes seemed to have been suppressed at that time. Time dragged on painfully slowly, and when they saw Ines as he had imagined her, he thought Carcel would lose his senses. And so he prayed that the night would pass quickly, and the world would be as orderly as his dreams. Ines Escalante's name would be added to the Escalante family tree, and Carcel would take her away from the Duke to a place where they could be alone, to a new mansion on the coast of Caldstella. He didn't believe this day would come, but here it was. Without a doubt, the guy thought himself distraught. At the moment of sending the marriage proposal, he decided that they would spend their honeymoon not in Mendoza or Esposa, but in Caldstella, where his fleet was moored. Carcel swore that it didn't make much difference at all, and the reason was certainly not because he was desperate to be alone with her. Perhaps the man had fallen in love with Ines after all. Could it be that he was now in love with Ines? People were discussing the woman who had become the wife of the arrogant Escalante. She looked particularly seductive, and they wanted to find a way to seduce her. Ines Valestena's beauty exceeded everyone's expectations, but she would not, in their opinion, be able to sustain Escalante's interest for long. And now, they couldn't wait for him to turn his own back on her. There was nothing easier than comforting a woman with a wounded heart. She appeared in a room that was filled with darkness, but even so, the rustle of her dress filled the space, echoing in ears. Both their hearts were pounding like mad. Carcel had feared she had come all this way in this form. That turned out to be true, and Ines even added that there had always been something of the exhibitionist in her. It was a joke, though. The heroine would invite him into bed and make the first move by skipping the strap of her nightgown. They would have to undress one way or another. She was only trying to make it easier for him. Did he need help getting undressed? Ines had heard that some people like to stay in their clothes, so she didn't mind putting her clothes back on. Though, Carcel stopped her, asking her not to do such a thing in front of him. He picked Ines up in his arms, showering her with compliments. The man decided to help her, since she had used up so much energy on those guests. Ines, on the other hand, was trying to guess why her husband reacted the way he did. After all, she had only shed some clothes. The calm sea, the sun rising over the forest, the campfire in front of the cabin. She wanted to think of nothing but peaceful things. After all, this marriage had been planned by her, and their wedding night was an integral part of that plan. Ines was now mentally prepared and convinced that soon enough Carcel would fall asleep. It was nothing. But still, for some reason, the man was in no hurry, and Ines's face spoke as if the girl had entered the battlefield. She was only trying to remind him of his duty, calling him even in bed Escalante. It was only a habit, though. After all, Ines would now also carry this surname, and if she also continued to call her husband, it would be hard to tell whether the heroine was doing it to him or to Miguel. Mentally, she didn't understand his speeches at all, as he was well put together. This is quite normal, and yet Ines didn't expect her husband to turn out to be that big. Carcel had asked her to shout his name when she felt good, so that everyone outside could hear it. However, kissing on the lips was forbidden, so he started with her neck. That wasn't the point, though. It seemed he would now have to heel her from head to toe to get a grasp on what it wasn't allowed for. She was enjoying it, though, which made her skin goosebumps. Except the man wasn't even doing anything strange yet. Ines begged him not to do that, but only to try to make her feel good. He wanted to know what she enjoyed and what she didn't, so that he would remember. And again, Ines began to speak the same words about not wanting this marriage. It was he who had sent the marriage proposal, even suddenly made a demand to her father to hand her over within a fortnight, and the Duke had showered him with curses. It was the marriage that Carcel ultimately desired. Whether they liked each other or not did not matter now. Both desired this marriage, and that was the reality of their marriage. And Ines still tried hard not to recognize it, for she had a habit of controlling the man, making the excuse that the marriage was desired solely by her. But Carcel wanted her whole, including her bad habits. Still, he was quite fond of bad women. If Ines's sole purpose was to get pregnant, there was no need for anything else. That was true. The hero was fine with that. However, Ines was now telling him to take her like an animal, to take her against her will, without regard for her feelings at all. Except that the heroine had already given her consent to everything, but Carcel kept pulling words out of her that she didn't want him because she found him dirty. It would have been easier for him to accept if Ines just wanted to end it quickly, because she would rather not go to bed with a libertine like him. She was pure of body to the point where there would be nothing to say to him. Still, the girl wished they could get along, to live peacefully, so Carcel could do with her as he pleased. And since the man couldn't cover his ears, he wanted to at least cover the heroine's lips. But he had no right to kiss those lips, no right to be angry or even to want to find out about her hidden past. The isolated girl lay with the guy who was the only exception in her life, and the guy felt sorry for her and showed interest. She had once captivated him, and Carcel felt the satisfaction of believing that perhaps he was the whole world to her. Now there was a feeling that this was becoming dust. The Duchess, on the other hand, could not believe that the day had come at last. Yesterday's events seemed so unreal that it seemed like a dream to her. A huge burden had finally been lifted. She wondered what she had done wrong to deserve this shame. Ines was finally a woman. Her mother worried that she would wear those hideous black rags for the rest of her life. The Duke asked Olga to stop, but now her tears even began to flow from happiness. She would have preferred to send her daughter to a convent so as not to bring shame on the family name. The woman was not worried about how Inez herself might have reacted. However, Carcel stood up for her, who threatened to follow the example of his wife and also ignore Olga. The true concern came from love, so if she truly loved her daughter, she would be more afraid of hurting her, not that her words would be ignored. They had a long journey ahead of them to Kalsdala, so the man apologized for not being able to stay longer, and a look of surprise appeared on Ines' parents' faces, but not a pleasant one. No ordinary mother would ever have such a low opinion of her daughter, nor would she embarrass her daughter before her own husband. Though the mother was rather happy with the fact of their marriage, so she was relieved that her fears had not materialized. Her father resides on an estate in Mendoza, while Olga stays in Perez, and so the whole family is rarely together, as it was on this day. From what Carcel saw, however, Ines simply began to ignore everything, and he could conclude that she had heard similar tirades countless times before. She shouldn't have let her mother talk that way, no matter what the family affiliation. Suddenly, his face reddened at the fact that Carcel had lewdly taken her the previous night, for which he apologized. He had behaved akin to an animal, had not shown the slightest bit of concern, making him no better than her mother. It was understandable that after the events of the previous night, she would be sick of her husband. That night, Carcel had not imposed himself on her. In fact, it was obvious that he was holding back rather than just continuing to act forcefully. It showed Inez that her husband had done his best in fulfillment of his duty. Of course, it had been performed quite vigorously indeed. She explained that there was nothing different in his actions, for the previous night had been their wedding night, and they were merely fulfilling their marital duties. Although Inez knew that it was not enough for him, she made sure that she did not satisfy him completely. Acting not too shy, or the process might have slowed down. After all, if she didn't get pregnant later on, it would be a problem. Carcel, on the other hand, didn't find her awkward. Her performance had mostly exceeded his expectations, though she couldn't recall something amazing. The way she had ridden him in the bathtub about 2 hours ago after a full night of lovemaking didn't count as amazing, the man supposed. Yes, she had squeezed him to the last drop. They chatted like a married couple should, because usually husband and wife did duty for about 10 minutes, but they didn't even score a proven 10 hours together, so Inez did much more than that. Carcel, in front of everyone, suddenly took her in his arms, from which the heroine began to resist. Now then, she realized that it would be useful to call him by his first name. Still, it wasn't really helping. The young couple did not notice how 6 hours passed. Of course, Inez had been sleeping on his lap the whole carriage ride, and he had ordered the coachman to slow down. She hadn't slept a wink last night, and she had literally just said she felt sick as soon as she got out of the carriage. It was the sudden ascent that made her ill. The girl, however, thought that when Carcel returned to work, she would go to the estate at Esposa. But he would not be there, although they did not have to be together all the time. However, the place was no less beautiful than any kind of vacation spot. Most of the officers with their spouses did not reside there. They stayed at their posts while their wives took care of the official residence in the capital. As a rule, married couples spent time together only on short vacations, but Kalsdala was an exception. Even loveless couples made the choice to live together here. The characteristic feature of the coastline was the rolling hills, which were sent down with a light sea breeze. Without the buzzing social life in Mendoza, everyone would have favored it. Here, however, it was different. It always reminded her of a particular person from her dreams. She could hear the occasional sound of sweat waves and see that image blurring. Her hands were covered with shivers of anxiety for the fact that Inez would soon lose him. Carcel's voice brought her back to reality, inviting her inside. They were not in the main port that day, but rather a tiny fishing port. The naval port was directly above the main one, and civilians were forbidden free passage. So what was Carcel doing there that day? And why help Emiliano? In return, the man asked Lieutenant Commander Alba for something. He had tried to bribe his superiors with such a thing, but the man had no choice but to look at him in a different light. The captain was truly touched. Carcel, on the other hand, preferred to think that he had accidentally caught him on vacation here in Mendoza. Besides, the gun and the rod with Admiral Calderon's name engraved on them were priceless gifts. He knew well how much he respected his grandfather, and was more concerned whether his wife would be satisfied with a mere handwritten letter in his handwriting. She was over the moon at the mere news. Carcel's wedding was just around the corner, so it was necessary to hurry. As he knew, the captain had a rather modest home, and he had never been much attracted to houses by the sea, so Alba thought he was sick of it. However, he would be a newlywed after all. Inez wondered where he had gotten all that luggage from, and if there was any room for her. Carcel seemed to have confused speech and thought in places. However, no matter how one looked at it, there seemed to be nowhere to put her things, And did the man even realize that it was all his? Ines knew this was the order of the day, for soldiers rarely lived at their duty station with their families. But still, Carcel had heard talk of how his colleague's wife seemed to have had a switch, and since they had started living in their residence, she had been unrecognizable. They saw each other in a whole new light, maybe because they spent so much time together. The housekeeper, Arandra, announced that the señorita's stay here would be unforgettable, so they could start by throwing out everything she didn't like. Except for the lieutenant, of course. Other people's belongings Ines refused to get rid of. Next, the woman showed her the pool table, as well as the pawn shop and chess tables. Even the man's co-workers were brought here once every 100 years. Now he seemed to be some kind of social outcast. Carcel took her to their bedroom, which the protagonist clearly liked. Moreover, there was a library, though Arandra had never caught the lieutenant reading. The man thought she spoke cautiously, as Ines might have run far away from him. There was a view of both the sea and the Navy residences on the hill, and the protagonist was madly enjoying it. Carcel's vacation was already ending tomorrow, something the girl was rather shocked by his inability to plan. Her plan, on the other hand, was very good. It spoke to the fact that the man only had 2 weeks left. The wedding had gone well, though, so there were no more problems in sight. Either way, Ines took a full breath because things were not what she had expected. She had thought this place would be more like a port. Although there was a famous port down the coast, the locals call it the main port. Ines walked inside then and was curious if this was it too. Carcel explained that it was one of the smaller ports called Sevilla. Apparently, she liked the painting, so the man suggested hanging it in the library. However, his speculation turned out to be false. Moreover, Ines asked that it be thrown away, so that henceforth her eyes would not be able to see it. The newlyweds met that morning in each other's arms. Carcel held her so tightly against him that it was suffocating. She didn't remember how she'd ended up here. The obscene mood and the Bible were imprinted in her memory. As a result, Ines had gotten carried away and had fallen into the arms of Morpheus at this very spot. No wonder her husband was popular with the ladies. They were only doing their duty, but apparently Carcel was enthusiastic about the honeymoon. The protagonist did not know how long he could ignore the need to find another woman for his bed, but even the ardor of true love cools with time, and therefore it is doubtful that lust born out of a sense of duty will last forever. It was only temporary. The noticeably cold morning air with its refreshing breeze, the curtains dancing to the sound of the soft crests of the waves crashing against the cliff. All this could be heard in Sevilla. When Ines awakened again, but in her body of 6 years old, the place began to have a hold over her like some kind of nightmare. Because of it, the girl spent years resenting Luciano, who had once again become a mere young man. Because of Sevilla, she was trapped in memories from the age of 16 when Ines first met Emilian Yao, until 20 when he died. She conjured up the night in which his body went cold and her child was taken from her. Waking up every morning with the knowledge that the night of Emiliano's death was coming, but now Ines no longer dreamed of Sevilla or him. Now the protagonist simply lay in the arms of another man and reflected on these events, for she knew that in this life none of them had taken place. She had enjoyed her husband's embrace, and now she could wake him up herself. The co-workers looked in amazement at the lieutenant, who smiled at the thought that Ines bore his last name. The men were even willing to place bets on what would appear next. Panic overtook them. Some even made the choice to sob. Essentially, marriage is still the nail in the coffin lid. So Carcel rose from the grave, but Lieutenant Escalante just walked in with a smile. He must have opted for her, given the choice not to show tears, until suddenly the smile was gone. Now the man looked annoyed. They thought the lieutenant was a pervert, which had something to do with his last night. Carcel did not deny that they were right. The colleagues had heard that the señorita was not the type of woman, but her spouse was a completely different matter. so it was a mystery how she had survived at all. However, the main character liked the marriage. This made everyone in the room gloomy because the lieutenant was just crazy. The man exhaled, asking everyone to stop prying into his personal affairs. Even though they weren't invited to the marriage ceremony, they were present at the banquet. Then they realized that the rumors were false. All the nonsense about the raven or the witch of the house of Valestena, or that the only reason for her fame was her own surname, was nonsense, for Ines turned out to be too beautiful. So the pervert's smile was not without reason, though what the man meant was not his strange tendencies, but the presence of a stormy first night with his new wife. They had heard that Ines had no charm whatsoever, yet the señorita was so ordinary and sweet that they felt like fools. Commander Barca had chided Escalante, thus withholding his bride. Had come these rumors. However, his wife was so beautiful that there were a huge amount of flowers and letters at all the military bases. It was this that Carcel was getting rid of. His wife was talked about with such excitement that he was unable to suppress the petty feeling rising in his throat. The dislike was growing for everyone, without a single exception. The servants were worried about Ines, for she had been staying at home all day. She had only eaten and slept. She had come to them from far away and knew no one else here, so this could be a cause of anxiety and depression. Of course, the protagonist had been loafing around lately, however. She had no desire to watch the surroundings. Did the girl really resemble a person without any purpose? Carcel was diligent to the point of being lazy every morning, which made Ines seem like a slacker in comparison. Unlike Mendoza, there was no entertainment here, except for the endless ocean. Not even money to spend. The present protagonist led such a quiet life that she must have forgotten. In high society, there is no better means of protest than a quiet life. In her first life, Ines was constantly clapped up to the ground, and the servants did not care, so she did not think about it. In the second life, however, the girl was so poor that she couldn't even afford servants. This time, it was different. She needed their testimony. After all, she had to prepare for the beautiful dissolution of this marriage. The estate was so small that it was worth warning the lad in advance that her luggage was to be delivered in 5 trips. First, the man brought the ones she treasured most. However, Raoul was stunned when he learned that there was no room inside. It was a stage of denial. What's more, Carcel's things barely even fit in here. He was originally her faithful servant that Ines had brought with her to the palace to use as a slave, but now in her social circle, he was just someone. In her first life, Raoul had been a street orphan whom she had rescued on a whim and left to work for her until the day she died. But now his rescue had become a deliberate move since he could come. There was no use for him, however. Eventually, the girl waved him off. But with his pleasant looks and tall stature, Raoul managed to become a footman at a young age. Serving directly to the nobility, he ferreted out its secrets and passed them to Ines. The guy was picky about the rest of the services, and when the protagonist slowly faded away due to memories of a better life, he and Joanna did their best to keep her fed and alive. So Raoul couldn't believe that his mistress would live in a place like this. While some must have dreamed of living in a house akin to this one, he was not one of them. The lad couldn't believe she liked it here, though the heroine had even put on weight. However, that couldn't suit a woman who insisted on wearing a different dress every day, though that wasn't a problem for other men. For now, Ines had no intention of moving out to the estate in Espos, but she promised to take Raoul with her when she married. But now she would not be able to hire any more servants here, and she should be grateful already for keeping the place in such good condition, intended for officers to live there for the duration of their service. Though Ines could leave the lieutenant to play the part of the poor officer alone and return herself, she had used the boy as a slave in his first life, but had no recollection of what became of him in his second. Now the protagonist was giving him a chance to live on his own. And even so, he was always unchanged. Raoul continued to act like a loyal dog waiting to be called by name. Before she said that the guy was getting worse and worse every day, he quickly changed the subject so as not to strain the situation. They were interrupted by Carcel, who had returned early. Ines hadn't even prepared anything, even though it wasn't her responsibility. He had missed today's training, but she found it hard to ignore the butler's stare. You can't be a lazy wife, although Carcel made no secret of the fact that he was naturally lazy. There had been a time when she'd grown tired of hearing his name after women's praises of his appearance. His assets were far from his face, but rather his chest and back. Those times had been a pleasure to her, but those days had passed, and now only the protagonists of that story remained. There was no one to gossip about them, because they were the only ones here. Ines offered to help him, but if she touched him now, it would not end with the removal of his pants. Was it possible that the girl wished to make amends for not preparing dinner? Was she really that easy to read? Although Carcel had known otherwise after 17 years, Ines was offering to help because she had not prepared a meal for him ahead of time, and she did not want to fail in that task. The protagonist decided to make amends by watching him change clothes like a pervert. Ines denied it, even though her husband himself had quizzed her about not doing it, because he had almost lost control of his desires. Now she already tried to get away from him, but Carcel managed to grab her in time, pinning her against his narrow back. He held himself in check even though it was difficult, and Ines had snuck in here on her own. The man squeezed her in an embrace as the heroine tried her best to break free. She smiled broadly, making Carcel stunned. They were supposed to behave with dignity in their own home. And here the servants were always wandering around. If she continued to talk about control, he promised to lose it. However, it was time to grow up. When the girl called him by his last name, it wasn't clear who she was referring to. Even she was smart to reason about herself in the third person. Raul apologized to the señorita. He had become practically family to her, so it was like catching Luciano's eye while in the arms of another man. The boy bestowed a radiant smile on her, making Carcel watch nervously. Next to him, Ines called him boy, but her husband picked on every word she said. Raul had taken care of her since they were still children. Even now, he was loyal to her. First, I will have to explain why such loyalty was necessary, and describe how broken Ines had been before. But this story is not intended for Carcel's ears. Her talent for treating men like dogs could not be taken away. Perhaps the girl did speak a little haughtily, but it was not so. It was about a servant younger than she was, so she would bow and call him Don Raul. And he was her dog. Carcel felt annoyed, but he did not know what the cause was. He even thought that his coming home so early might have disappointed her. He even had the impression that he had interrupted their reunion. Ines did not deny their intimacy, but her husband had never seen the servant before, for he might have found him intrusive. Raul was surprisingly experienced, intelligent, and sensitive to the needs of the nobility, which made Carcel's mouth water. Moreover, Ines wanted to talk to him a little more, but asked her husband's permission. Besides, she had nothing to hide. She just liked to go into detail, and in the future, a man should keep that in mind. For some reason, he liked it. Being inside the house, Carcel watched the sweetly chirping couple. He knew Raul was no match for him, but his refinement and looks were qualities that would be considered winning among the nobility. Even so, the footman would not succeed in seducing Ines. Her only concern was her looks, which is why she became Ines Escalante. At the age of 6, the girl pointed a finger at him, and from that moment it became clear as day that her standards for appearance were unusually high. Even though their wedding night was her first, the feeling that she was ignorant about men did not arise at all. Even though the girl pretended to be taciturn, there was no way she would be able to conceal it. Still, the first night had been an extremely long one. Carcel cared only if Ines had had 10 or 20 men in the past, but one was the worst possible number. He was worried about just being near her. Would he be able to win? The impishness with which his lips spoke her name. It must have come from long ago, when they'd been together. Yet for the past 17 years, there had been nothing between them. Idas had once exposed so many nasty emotions in his dreams, but Karcel had forgotten them. So now the wretched feelings were returning. Regardless of what he was experiencing, Ines was there for him, and her reference was him. Arandra went a little overboard in brushing her hair, though Mistress felt no pain. However, her comb was letting out and the girl was even more nervous. Karcel walked into the room. Idas had asked to hire him a maid, so one could still be found in Mendoza. However, there were no more rooms left to hire. Even the servants and gardener occupied a separate cottage, and they could let someone go and free up a room for a personal maid. The man would not concede to cooking, but he had never complained about the meat until then. In his opinion, it broke while cooking the vegetables. The meat had to be roasted just enough so that it browned on the outside but remained tender on the inside. Karcel lifted a strand of her hair, trying to help. Now they would definitely have to bring Juana here. By the way, she was getting married in Perez, and her lover was there, whom the man was going to move as well. Ines was extremely impressed with his face every time. Even when he was doing something funny, he managed to look cute rather than pathetic. Her taste in men, however, left much to be desired. In her first life, she had chosen a filthy scoundrel who was not fit to be her husband, and in her second life she had chosen a poor orphan who worked as an artist. Just as Oscar's status was not enough to redeem his depraved lifestyle, neither was Emiliano's love and devotion. There was little to make up for the pathetic reality. Karcel's skills were very even, so the man was waiting for the reward. Ines needed to see how much he was crazy about her. She had said it was his duty to take her, and her duty was to be taken, so they did what they had to do. Then why was the girl getting so wet? Something had definitely happened to his sanity after that night, otherwise Karcel had really lost it. Ines, on the other hand, wanted to know what it was that he found so exuberant about her. The couple abandoned the formalities that Mendoza was supposed to adhere to, and she continued to wear the same boring black outfits without even applying makeup. Was there anything about her current look that was capable of arousing a man? So far, Ines had never once fallen under the spell of his charms, and the reason for cooperation lay in enforcing the plan. From the outside, Ines looked like a woman with long, unrequited feelings for Karcel and behaved accordingly. She even acted as if she desperately longed for this marriage. A woman without pride, married almost in the blink of an eye, though the marriage proposal could hardly be characterized as having been made in advance. For this kind of woman, this honeymoon must have been something akin to a dream. Idas was convinced that the decision to sleep with him whenever he wanted was the right one, and from now on she only had to gradually reduce the number of times they were together. The plan was to demand that he sleep with her and be refused, but their marriage would come to that already. The result would be that Karcel would lose interest and any attachment to her. That's when their marriage will end in divorce, and Ines will be able to gain true freedom. At the end of this life, she will face her true death. There were a number of divorce cases in which the testimony of servants was accepted, but it was essential that it should not look like it had been bought. There have been cases in which both husband and wife have taken to hastily bribing servants before the trial to get the necessary statements in return. Some servants were clever, while others might not be. A mistake could lead to the fate of the court to consider the testimony of all the others to be bought. There was another case that took an interesting turn. The party paid a servant, but the result was that he gave testimony of a very different kind. In the end, the servant broke the bargain and betrayed his employer, which could be the case if the servant harbored hatred or had been the victim of unfair treatment in the past. What you sow is what you reap. People tended to see only the good sides of the person they liked, regardless of objective reality. A famous example is the case of the Duchess of Casia, who was always kind. Because of this, The judgment handed down by the court was more favorable. The girl mispronounced her name, for which she scolded herself. This year, Lady Ines was only 10 years old. She asked not to change the subject, but the man asked what she intended to do about the blabbering of the tipsy lawyer. That was it. A reputation built over a long period of time. Servants must never find out they were being bribed. In fact, there was no need to try to bribe them at all. The servants were getting more than enough. In fact, one of them was even sure she was grossly overpaid. Mr. Carcel was generous when it came to his servants. So it was everyone's dream to work here. It was unexpected. Her husband had made the verboten decision, and so Ines no longer had any reason to worry. The servants were delighted that Carcel had found his life partner. What's more, she was also very generous. Even though they were paid a lot, the free food still worked. It's hard not to feel favor with someone who is very generous. In this world, it's money that touches the heart. It would be best to find out how much they were paid. But even so, it wouldn't do any good. The servants might take her for a haughty noblewoman who had no idea of their humble way of life. But she knew it was poverty. After all, life with Emiliano was her immediate definition. But even that was not enough for her to truly understand the lives of ordinary people. When they ran away, they occasionally sold whatever jewelry and paintings Ines had taken from the house, so that they occasionally managed to get large sums of money. However, at that time, the girl did not really know what the real value of things was, so she often sold everything for next to nothing. They were hopeless romantics. The gardener was busy cleaning the branches of the trees, and the servants had to have dinner by this time. Ines was too inattentive, so much so suddenly finding herself in this strange place, she felt lonely. Experiencing this feeling, the protagonist wasted days only to realize that she had closed her heart to everyone around her. She had never realized how much they cared for her until now. Ines wanted to talk to the gardener first, and then to the rest of the staff. But whenever she met her eyes with the butler, he seemed like an extremely stubborn man. The man could have managed to disappoint the heroine, because during the whole time she did not lift a finger. But achieving the goal of a great plan requires a significant amount of time. And today's day was simply beautiful. If Ines created a pleasant atmosphere, they wouldn't be hard to subdue. So it was fine. From this day forward, creating a good aura in this house would be towards the goal. Carcel didn't understand what it all meant. He was met by his wife, who was not at all like himself. She was just an ordinary. Ines bloomed like a flower, asking how her husband's day was. Her voice was so affectionate, like body against body. Another soul, on top of everything. She grabbed his hand and dragged him inside. Arriving at Calztala, the girl was completely depressed, although the man thought she looked quite nice. This morning, she had a sudden thought as to why Ines had decided to turn the place upside down. The house was a mess, and there was so much stuff in it that there was barely enough room for people, so she was just in time. Especially since the Lord didn't pay that much attention. Actually, that was the reason why the manor was in such a state. She grabbed Carcel under her arm, crushing, making the man wonder what the spectacle was all about. Even as a child, she had never forced herself to smile at anyone. Not the crown prince, not anyone else in the ruling family. Ines was somewhat fair, in that she was equally unkind to everyone. She wasn't trying to change too much. In fact, upon his return, the girl intended to get permission. There was no need for it, though, because everything here belonged to her. Therefore, this moment was meaningless. This trait was common to all nobles, but Ines in particular was used to giving orders. Perhaps marriage to Oscar would have suited her better. Why would the protagonist even think of that? After all, she even strangled herself today. It really wasn't fragrance oil, but perfume. She was really acting like a real noblewoman, which wasn't like her at all. Sitting in front of the mirror, did she even once revisit the events of that night? The day had been too long. and the time of darkness seemed very far away. Ines was disturbed by the fact that everyone on the estate was working hard. They must have been exhausted, but they just continued to stand by and wait without interruption. How meticulous they were in the performance of their duties. Carcel realized what her purpose was. One thing seemed clear to him for certain. Hitherto Ines had paid absolutely no attention to him. Her kindness had been directed to the servants. In reality, the attention she had shown a few moments ago was nothing more than a performance for them. It was not for his sake. The lieutenant had recently been studying the señorita's face. She had just asked him how he would feel about replacing the fence surrounding the estate. The man was simply wondering as to the reason for her recent behavior, which was what he had asked. He appreciated her efforts, but simply did not understand why she was so determined to make it happen. If it was true, he should have chosen a particular emotion to stick to. Ines hadn't changed a single piece of furniture in her room since she was 6 years old, so she tried to take care of their home. It was to the benefit of both of them, as well as their guests. In order to invite someone to their house, it should have been in proper condition. She didn't even have anyone in mind, but Carcel did. So she decided to be clearer. The protagonist was doing it for his guests. Except it was hard to call it a really good plan. Almenara was a little nervous, but he tried in every way to please the wife of his colleague, who, by the way, looked at him like a hawk at prey. This was probably why the man was behaving so strangely and wished to be allowed to go home. José Almenara, the third son of Count Almenara, was a surprisingly simple man, modest and shy by nature, along with... When the queen remembered that Ines had run away from her wedding to the crown prince, but had also returned with a child by a commoner, thus becoming spoiled goods, she was, in her opinion, still the noble daughter of the master of the house of Valestena. If a girl recognized her flaws and would become a faithful wife to a more experienced man, only then would she find happiness. For example, the role of the second wife of Count Almenara would suit her perfectly. In his second life, he almost became her stepson. Anyway, the military academy had killed so many people. What had Carcel done to this man since he had so vehemently denied everything? As it turned out, the man had no idea how peaceful his life in the Navy had been. Now Almenara would have to come clean, for Carcel claimed he had never abused anyone. If obeying one's superiors was considered bullying, he knew plenty of men ready to jump off their ships and put an end to it right now. All depending on whether they were in a good relationship or not, the newlyweds came out of them decidedly odd. It's like an adult teaching a child. Carcel should not have forgotten about showing deference to Count Almenara, so the man realized his mistake and even apologized, albeit through force. Ines was very different from the image that had been formed thanks to rumors. She was not at all like a person compared to a crow. In fact, the girl was an incredible beauty with kind speeches. He'd been forced to use all of his vacation time this year, of course. But when would he ever get a chance to get an apology from the lieutenant? Not to mention the fact that the señorita is such a nice woman. So all in all, it had been a very productive day. His aunt, Empress Cayetana, was the very embodiment of pure ambition. His father, who had set some big goals for himself and worked throughout his life to achieve them, was keeping up with his sister with great difficulty. As it turned out, the Empress feared that Señorita Ines might suddenly overshadow her in the eyes of all and sundry, in a similar manner to the way in which she herself had once overshadowed others. Therefore, although she was not at all pleased to see the Crown Prince following Ines at his heels, the Empress could not allow her to join another family, even if it meant giving the nasty crow the status of Oscar's consort. But as a result, the girl who was once not good enough for her son, but was too good to part with, instead became her nephew's bride, which was just as well. Ines was no longer in the way. All that remained was to use her appropriately. The Empress had made a hobby of sending them lists of receptions to attend. While the protagonist rejected them Except for the ones that came personally from the Empress, the man attended all the events, except to emphasize the fact of Ines' absence in the form of an empty seat beside him. In the Empress's opinion, this signaled the Duke of Valistena's support of the Crown Prince, and was a demonstration of the greatest of marital alliances. It was a way of reminding the Duke that there was no turning back. That was why she was adamant to make Ines Escalante. Since arriving at Kalstala, the guest had been able to get the rest that the girl had hoped for. It was very difficult for him because his fiancé also wanted to take care of the partial arrangement of their estate, so he was concerned. However, Ines was sure that the woman would feel differently because the place had many charms of its own. Even the lieutenant looked happy. He looked more handsome than usual, so that might have spilled over into a tangible problem. It had happened just after the wedding, however. Almanara knew that the real reason was because of her, and it wasn't idle words. She began to tell him about her plans, thinking about Carcel and his hobbies, so there was no doubt now that he was living in a world of his own greatness. Ines had invited him to come back when the renovations were finished, and for some reason, Escalante was fine with that. However, Almanara had promised the lady to bring all the officers so that she could get to know them. With the help of her husband's closest acquaintance, Ines was able to confirm that Carcel's promiscuous lifestyle remained in Mendoza. The man did not look like a man capable of lying to his superior spouse. However, she didn't find out much. Carcel attended all the social events, so she didn't understand the reason for his behavior. Besides, this kind of entertainment didn't give him pleasure. Even now, even as she enjoyed herself, Ines was losing touch with reality. Carcel stared covetously at Ines, accusing her of lying. He felt as if he was being sexually exploited. His infrequent touches provoked what the girl thought of Almanar, who was part of her plan. However, why would she ponder Jose while they were at it? Carcel wondered why Ines did not call him by his last name, for he thought him unworthy of it. The protagonist became convinced of his folly, deciding to avoid pressuring him in the future. For the only thing she needs is for a few harmless birds to spread the word about her husband so she can use it as evidence during the divorce. But even now, Ines still wished he would get along with everyone. Perhaps it was because of the affection she had developed for him. In Ortega, adultery was not even considered a vice. The fact of its existence could play in court, but in other cases it could hardly be considered significant. Nobles who did not seek romances on the side were found old-fashioned. Ines, on the other hand, did not intend any harm, so Carcel would not be touched. The protagonist will just use him for a while until she gives him his old life back. Plus, in his original life after refusing to marry, the man didn't even get a title. So if a comparison is made, freedom will be truly perfect. Once again, Carcel caught her deep in thought. The construction around the estate that had begun a few weeks earlier was nearing its completion, and the sound of hammers banging in the early morning hours was no longer audible. The perfect fence and greenhouse were finally in sight. Only a few problems remained to be fixed on the estate itself, but the result would be seen within 4 days. The passage of time was often conveyed by sounds akin to these. Early in the morning, Ines complained about her husband's insatiable temper. Did he really spend every night like this in his past? Had Carcel obsessed all the women who shared his bed with him and driven them to such overwork? Rumors would surely have passed about it. His liaisons were definitely of a promiscuous nature, but there were some things the gossips kept quiet about. He was frighteningly good looking. Somehow Ines thought he made her look like a wreck. But the thought of a servant entering the room while she slept was terrifying. It was just in time that Carcel, who was to blame for his wife's long sleep, came in. The reason for his pleasure was understandable, considering how the girl had been tormented all night long. Speaking of her, why was Ines the only one who was exhausted? And while the protagonist tried in every possible way to kick him out of the room, Carcel ignored, wanting to help her dress. Ortega men never eat breakfast in the bedroom unless they are bedridden or on their deathbed. Her husband admitted to deliberately tiring himself out before returning home, although Ines seemed determined to get revenge when she was distracted. Of course, she was aware of the significant difference in their sizes, but it hurt her pride. Her hands were even shaking, which made Carcel offer to feed her. They continued to argue, so he took matters into his own hands. A bite punishment awaited him, but even so, the Lord thought she was adorable. And if this continued, getting a real chance to have a child would definitely not have to wait for these two. Except, based on Carcel's reaction, you'd think he hadn't even considered it. Dines's suggestions to systematize the rules and choose the days with the highest probability when she could get pregnant. Though even those words were arousing to this pervert. The heroine wanted to designate days while he would just do it on a regular basis. In his mind, his wife was just resorting to subterfuge, though he was the one having fun looking at her. From that day forward, however, they could try to bring some purpose to the events of that evening. Carcel asked her to fix his collar so that he could hug her and thank her. Ines, on the other hand, became uneasy as things were not going according to plan. And while the others saw how badly she was gaunt, the girl kept saying that her life was perfect. Ever since she'd gotten word from her mother in her past life about her suicide attempt, every letter had been betrayed by fire. That day, seeing the protest, Olga had been horrified and so disciplined her through letters. Despite all this, her mother could not give up on her because she continued to love her daughter in her own way. When Ines learned the given truth, she was completely and utterly exhausted and stopped resisting in the end. She didn't want children because of some letter. However, you can't undo what you've done. If Olga really wanted to know how her daughter was doing, she would not have written a letter of such content. To the messenger, the estate looked like an abandoned castle, but he was sure that Esposa would be hers. Apparently, the Duchess had no warm feelings for the place, spending most of her time in Mendoza. Duchess Escalante was a noble woman with a meek smile and a weak temper. In Ines's past life, they had met often, and by chance. Raoul went on about how the lieutenant's younger brother would be promoted to lieutenant upon graduation from the military academy and spend his life moving back and forth from his post in Mendoza. And if the heroine didn't want all that, she shouldn't have chosen Escalante's eldest son. So if she decides to leave, he'll just take him with her. About 15 days ago, news came to Perez about the artists Ines had patronized. Magdalena had begun to be recognized for painting portraits, though she was too talented for that. Maria had apparently spent the entire year in Mendoza working on a single portrait of Countess Gormaz. This was not surprising for the narcissistic client. And in Regarcia, Lourdes and Emiliano will be helping with the restoration of the cathedral mural as winter sets in. Every casual remark Rael made about her former lover was a reminder that he was alive. Time after time, Ines kept telling herself that their paths should never cross again, that she simply couldn't turn her back on the 17-year-old boy. It's not worth going any farther than that. The protagonist decided not to break the life of neither herself nor him. Raoul was appointed valet to their estate, which Carcel was clearly not happy about. He thought he could manage without him, and the boy was quite young. The Lord was clearly displeased, and Raoul acted as if he neither saw nor heard him. Ines explained that he would continue to work as a footman, serving her husband and running errands for the lady. Even though he could feel Carcel disliking him, the reason for that remained a mystery to him. If Raoul would simply serve him to the best of his ability, the mistress would be satisfied. The hero had nothing to do but simply agree with the will of his spouse. However, he liked the fact that compared to other servants who simply handed him a shirt and let him dress himself, this pride boy was quick to recognize Carcel's needs. That wasn't even what annoyed him, though. Ines was reading the Bible in the library, which she did on Thursdays. And since they were still newlyweds, it would be best to avoid any strife. Carcel asked the guy not to bother with silly advice. Raul said that Escalante had succeeded in winning the Signora's favor by means of the estate he had stolen from the lieutenant, captain, and he had just as much to gain from the footman. That is why Carcel ordered a surveillance of the new valet to find out about his weakness. He reasoned that he and Ines needed to make sure that the purchase of wine was conducted in the absence of misappropriation. A man should have been sent there for a whole day to report constantly on the boy's every move. Alfonso, on the other hand, laughed, for he saw only jealousy here. All that remained for him to do, however, was to proceed to execution. It suddenly began to pour, so Raul decided to go to the wine cellar by himself. However, Ines wished to join him. The lad was resentful that his mistress was visiting El Tabeo for the first time, and Carcel had not bothered to take her there. He intended to do so, however. So at that moment, the girl justified her husband's lack of time, even though he was flirting with her day and night. And if she wanted, Ines could have gotten here herself long ago. Raul thought that Escalante had the task of showing his wife the city, arranging a romantic trip. He was worried, but the girl did seem much more relaxed than she had while living in Valestana. There was no denying that the lieutenant might have had something to do with it. His status was not as high as that of the same crown prince that Lady Ines had rejected early on. As the eldest son of House Escalante, he represented an excellent candidate for a husband. Despite his muscularity, when it came to a spouse, the lieutenant showed a surprisingly gentle side. His passion, interest, and kindness for her was so over the top. Carcel could be perfect until his old habits returned. For that reason, Raul couldn't help but be wary. It wasn't a gala, but a modest dinner with wine, so he thought baklava would be perfect as a dessert, but it wasn't easy to find the right ingredients. The footman explained that it was feasible at the port. Moreover, at the first reception she organized, they were to dominate the local scene. Except she didn't have a competition in mind. Alfonso ended up telling off Mario, who was driving the Signora's carriage, because he kept looking back. Fortunately, they managed to learn something. As the girl was getting out of the carriage, Mr. Ballin jumped out and quickly opened his umbrella to help her down. He also let her rest her hand on his wrist, and then offered to step on his foot to keep her dress from getting wet. But Ines hated the very thought of it, and told Raul to stop. Alfonso inquired about the señorita, but Mario no longer followed her. It was a failure. The servant Hugo had also failed because he had gazed at the beauty of his mistress. But the other candidate for the role of spy told how around noon Ines was outside, making the rounds of the garden so that Raul stayed with her the whole time. She had a job on the second floor, so she peeped at them secretly from the window. The footman was holding an umbrella with one hand and fanning the lady with the other. He was sweating so profusely that Lady Ines threw her handkerchief in his face. This lady was more useful than a manservant. And when the señorita returned home around 1 o'clock, she preferred not to dine, so Raul brought a tray with various baked goods. At the sight of the one was quite annoyed, as if she wanted to eat them at all. Her report was so long that Alfonso asked her to shorten the story, so the girl began to list all the facts, like how many times the mistress had smiled and laughed. Kara's maid had achieved some success. On the day of the reception, there were many people gathered at Escalante Manor. There was a friendly atmosphere. Lady Acevedo asked Ines where her husband was, to which she replied that they were in the greenhouse with Commander Barca. One could only hope that they were not gambling in the middle of the day. As it turned out, Commander Barca and Lieutenant Salvatore were gamblers. The ladies said that the former had solid skills, which was quite dangerous. Lieutenant Acevedo looked very manly, despite what his wife said. They proceeded to initiate Ines into the secrets of the men's private lives, wanting to disperse the gathering in question. It came to mind whether to call them for dessert, or whether Señorita Escalante would take them around the estate. In her past life as crown princess, she would have laughed if anyone had called it a reception. Not only is the event tiny in scope, but the venue is even worse. The guests were far from being part of Mendoza's high society. except for those who came from important enough families to be high-ranking officers, like Carcel, Jose, and Commander Barca. But all the people there were the same and far less corrupt than those who were mired in the vanity of the city of Mendoza. It wasn't a palace and it wasn't Mendoza. Maybe the contentment Ines had always craved from life was right here in this small, cozy garden. Raul praised his mistress, emphasizing how much effort she had put in. Those present could feel the difference, for here, literally every millimeter had been touched by Señorita Escalante's hands. He was in danger. He was about to be drawn into the maelstrom of the Marquise's bed. Ines intervened, adding that she was looking for the woman. The Marquise, on the other hand, was interested in her, since the lieutenant always spent a lot of time alone here. She was curious to see how this house had changed, having finally found its mistress. Ines had hoped to gather all the ladies together to present a small gift, but since this was their first meeting, the Señorita asked the Marquise to do it. The girls had not seen such a lovely library before, for on a clear day they could see the sun setting over the ocean. A gloomy aura emanated from the woman in the corner to whom someone had given alcohol. Mrs. Salvatore was feeling fine. Could it be that she had drunk herself to such a state? The guest sat down and mumbled that this pretty little house actually used to belong to a non-lieutenant Escalante. However, Ines already knew this, but now was the important state of the woman. If she threw up, however, it would be a pity for the new carpet. Mrs. Salvatore denied being drunk, but her husband had no need of alcohol, for he was always out of his mind. She couldn't even say to herself that this was her first marriage, but there was a good reason why his marriages didn't last long. He was ruining women's lives. Ines knew this. Although she had never even had a taste of alcohol in this life, she still vividly remembered the years she had spent in the misery of addiction in the past, when she would get drunk in the morning, just getting out of bed. The money, the hair, the best years, the chance to live with a normal man, the hopes set on life, all this Mr. Salvatore had lost because his other wives had no choice but to run away. Such a life they preferred to death. However, she had another plan, to unleash her wrath on him. Ortega had a wonderful procedure known as divorce. If a woman would just do it, she would not have to die or to kill. The guest, on the other hand, considered herself different from Duke Valestana's precious daughter, the future Duchess, except that she didn't know what the protagonist had gone through because she even married Carcel Escalante. Just in time, the Lord appeared, who noted that the Lord and Mr. Salvatore at the moment looked identical. Fortunately, he managed to lift the spirits of both ladies. Though it was already a bit too much, Carcel didn't necessarily need to pick up the drunken troublemaker so swiftly and confidently. Ines even reflected on how good her spouse was when it came to the female gender. Her sharp tongue pricked him with sharp speeches, as if he enjoyed the company of Señorita Salvatore. That's probably why he lifted her up on his shoulder. This was seen by the others, causing questions to pour in on the heroine. They tried to make sure that Escalante had come because he wanted to see his young wife. In their eyes, he was separated from her for a moment. However, it was as if even that proved unbearable for him. It was rumored that immediately after his marriage, he had finally settled down. Left alone, Carcel denied Mrs. Salvatore's attractiveness. Of course, he looked at his own face in the mirror every day, but he thought his wife was much better. She was the only woman he found so. A slight blush accompanied his confession speeches. Today he had only one beautiful figure to look at, Ines, and she did not know him at all if she thought that Carcel enjoyed having a drunken woman's body fall upon him. Ines was prickly on the tongue, but her spouse did not keep silent and even bit her because she had not earned the right to take offense. Suddenly, he had the urge to confess, causing the man to identify himself as the person who had offended Ines. It should have been done sooner. Carcel confessed that he had made her laugh because he had led a life worthy of ridicule, so he was willing to be punished. Mentally, however, Ines wanted to stop everything. He needed to stay alive to have an affair with another woman, because then she would be able to divorce him without any interference. The only thing she wanted was for her spouse to remain as he was. Ines asked him to keep his perfect face in pristine condition. Thus, the guilt would be made up for. However, she declared that she would never leave him first. Her choice was obvious. Carcel believed that even if his appearance deteriorated, Ines would simply begin to rate him a 99 rather than a 100. So her words were not without meaning. Suddenly, his peaceful stay was broken by Raul, announcing the arrival of a servant from Lieutenant Salvatore's estate. As it turned out, the man had forgotten something in the manor, but the servants couldn't find anything. Carcel explained that the man was only freaking out, which was not the first time this had happened. The lieutenant was drunk most of the time, so this would cause even more trouble. What's interesting is that Raul found out about the surveillance. After a while, it became clear that Lieutenant Escalante wished to show his wife the view. Rather, he wanted to live with his beautiful wife in a similarly beautiful place. This was unexpected. Ines didn't understand what the conversation was about, so Señorita Acevedo revealed that Carcel had purchased the estate shortly before their wedding. The man had previously lived in a large house near the headquarters, and he had been living there since he had been commissioned as a junior lieutenant. The Lord had indeed acquired the house in question, which sounded like a no-brainer to Ines. Naturally, the place was not without its charms, especially since it had such a breathtaking view. The balcony was bursting with men chattering about the armory. Moreover, Carcel was bragging about the hunting weapon Ines had given him. Now they wanted to go on a joint hunt, while Ines did not believe that her spouse could commit such a naive and stupid act for her. Raul discovered the weakness of his master. It was known that Ines would not tolerate such a prank, as it was considered tantamount to an insult. Except that it was Raul who fell under suspicion. After a while, it occurred to him that it was a matter of jealousy. And rightly so. In the absence of jealousy, Carcel wouldn't have given the order. Being a loyal servant, Raul simply wanted to beg the man not to harm the lady. This phrase probably led Escalante to ask if the valet loved his wife. For some reason, the fellow blushed and began to explain that his loyalty to her was of a far more noble nature. In any case, he wished to refrain from mentioning it to Lady Ines in the future. Carcel would not mind, however, but Raul did not want her to be hurt in any way. In principle, such a thing would not even amount to a scratch for Ines. This guy was overflowing with energy, as now he would do anything to make a man fall in love with the heroine and put him in his place. She couldn't even believe that the footman had shown up to denounce her immediately after the conversation they had had. Even so, he believed that Escalante was the most suitable partner for the mistress. She was the only lady of the house of Valestena, and therefore deserved only the best. When the crown prince ascended the throne, the lieutenant would be a close confidant of the new ruler and would not remain a soldier forever, which meant they would not have to play family in this run down Hovel for too long. Ines believed that wives and husbands lived a life of deception. The same went for children. People deceived themselves, and Carcel was no exception. She had once been unhinged and had hidden that fact before the wedding, but now it was okay. This could be their opportunity. Ines intended to act in a way directly opposite to the way Raul had relied on. But even so, there would be benefits to be gained. The beginning had been made here. The boy proceeded to lay out the information about the surveillance that had started 10 days ago. And it sounded a little weird. Some might say he was the epitome of a common soldier, but there were countless gambling houses, bars, and brothels in the port, catering exclusively to officers, and the latter took shameless advantage of them. It turned out that most of the officers practically lived in the gambling houses and bars, with only a few living a lifestyle like Carcel's, working out and sweating on the training ground. By nature, Escalante is a good man. From time to time, he even experienced guilt prematurely. But it was still easy for Ines to imagine him seducing another woman. In fact, he didn't need to seduce either, for his looks alone were already a work of art. Moreover, Carcel was kind by nature, so he would not ruin a woman's life. So there was no need to take any urgent measures against him. The Lord had gone a little crazy after he got married. Soon, everything will be back to normal. Raoul continued his report, telling about Munaz, who had a candidate for a wife. The father had given all available resources to help the senior lieutenant in the interest of his only daughter, but 6 months and more later, the real wife returned. If Ines uses this information at the right time, she will be able to save some women who are in trouble just like her old one. 2 weeks later, the ladies visited a hunting ground on the outskirts of the naval port, enjoying the sunny weather. Ines's older brother had instructed her to listen for the sound of gunfire and the breaking of tree branches beneath her body that would point her to the answer. The girl rejoiced, for the shot that had just sounded must have meant that someone had missed, for she heard neither the cry of an animal nor the fall of a bird. Nothing less was expected of her. Meanwhile, Raoul was frightened by the sound of frequent firing and hid. The little girl believed that she would marry the crown prince, and then the boy would do the job properly. Her brother was happy to teach her to hunt foxes. That's what this natural beauty with hunting grounds reminded her of. And the shooting alerted everyone, sharpening their focus on Carcel. Ines alone didn't understand why he wouldn't stop. The other ladies admired his skills. The heroine had praised him some time ago, but it was far better to walk away empty-handed than to be alone, constantly shooting everything in sight. However, her life was not that terrible. Carcel was glad with all his heart to be married, and he acted as if she were bored with waiting for him. The señoritas, however, whispered, thinking that Ines had taken great pains to conceal from them how pleased she was. Earlier, she had said how proud she was of her husband. Moreover, this was the first time the lieutenant had been accompanied on a hunt by his wife. Is it possible that every shot Escalante found its target, even under the angry looks of his superiors? Because this thought of Ines was interrupted by a question from her spouse. She trembled at his childish response. And being in the carriage, the men continued to balk. Ada suggested attending the nearest weekly mass in the main chapel, as the señoritas had advised. He didn't really care in principle, but a family mass would be far more convenient. The man showed a lot of work, but from what she had heard, the girl was convinced that he had always gone to mass in the main chapel before. Now that they were married, Ines did not want her spouse to be criticized because of her. Of course, the real problem was something else. She had no idea that mass was the main event at Calsdilla, and she missed the chance to help Carcel meet at least one woman at it. Escalante himself didn't see the need for it, so the excessive show of concern on his wife's part seemed a little odd. However, it did excite him a good deal. Because of the rules, they only had to do it once a day, so the pressure made him sensitive. By the way, this wasn't the case with the other ladies. However, it didn't matter now. Her own scent turned him on a lot, although the smell of perfume could easily be smelled on his chest. Right now, the heroine even lacked any desire to immediately hit this rude man. Perhaps a suitable opportunity would present itself in the chapel. During the first mass, an opportunity came in the form of a girl smiling brightly at the Lord. The girl asked for a few minutes alone to talk. While still a toddler, Ines had refused the crown prince, citing her ignorance. Based on his own words, the wrong choice she had made in deciding such an important matter as marriage was the result of her belief in some completely unfounded superstition. These words wounded the little girl quite deeply, so she asked him a little to refrain from causing her further suffering. Oscar, on the other hand, wished to hear from her words of affirmation that she had no serious intentions about Escalante. He assured her that the boy would only cause trouble by going out with other women. However, the crown prince himself had no idea of his fate. He jumped out of the room, continuing to vilify his brother while Enrique Osorno stood outside the door, watching the scene. When he grows up, he will be a lush, healthy young man who will cherish his wife. Simply put, there would be no accidents, no illnesses, no wars. He was far from the subject of divorce. In this empire, the most successful woman was the one who had gone through a divorce or whose husband was dead or missing. A woman who was not tied to anything or anyone, who could live independently. That is the only way to have complete freedom. And therefore, divorce is the heroine's only goal. Of course, it would be just fine if there was no need to get married at all. But for the daughter of the house Velistena, this option is simply never suitable. She would bring shame on her parents. She would be banished to the lowest rung of high society, which is painful enough. Moreover, an unmarried woman was not allowed to make decisions about her own property, even in her old age. She had to marry, only then would she be treated as an adult. Enrique noticed a change in the girl after she returned to Mendoza, as she began to wear only black. Inez continued to make a plan. She needed a man who would one day disappear from her life legally. Recognition of title and property, a respectable pension, the right to independence. No matter how stupid a man was, he was capable of obtaining all of these things once he reached the age of 17, but a woman had to go through all sorts of hardships, from marriage to divorce and maybe even bereavement, to obtain similar benefits. But at the moment she had no other options. Ines would rather marry a man who would die shortly after the birth of their child. One sacrifice was not part of her plan. One day he would leave her of his own free will. A man with a face so perfect he would be the object of all women's lust. And that's when the little girl made her decision. It would take someone who would let her divorce easily. It would take the greatest ladies' man in the world. And now the beautiful blonde wanted to steal that man, while Carcel occupied himself with foolishly avoiding other women. Ines kept an eye on her, as it turned out, for good reason. Señorita Maria had high hopes of attending the main character's wedding ceremony, but as a result, it didn't work out. She liked Carcel so much that she even burned Ines with her gaze. It's a perfect choice. Escalante himself thought that such a prank would cause her irritation. The protagonist continued to chat sweetly with Maria, who wished in any possible way to bring her congratulations to the lieutenant personally. Yes, and curiosity, what kind of woman Carcel chose, was taking over. She spoke sarcastically, but at the same time tried to maintain her dignity. Ines was captivated by her sweetness. Would it not make her hate her rival more than ever? She noted that it would be more appropriate to call Escalante her husband. After all, she had chosen him. And her plan had worked. Maria insisted on the need to talk to Carcel, but he was reluctant, citing another event with Ines. The only thing left for them to do was to go home. As it turned out, the matter was her grandfather's illness, who, by the way, did not understand why the man did not just ignore his granddaughter. The captain felt that Maria had to learn to accept reality, though the reason was most likely because she had made a passing mention of the old man's condition in front of Ines. Carcel only did not want to appear as a heartless brat, although he himself was annoyed by his spouse's behavior. Maria behaved like a court child, entertaining great hopes, but the way she clung to Escalante for so many years could not be called normal, especially when he was engaged to another woman. The captain, by the way, wasn't quite sure why the man was fumbling. Because it was Ines, who had bound herself in marriage to someone who was not her equal. Moreover, it was not clear why such a beautiful woman was surrounded by such strange rumors, because she looked like an intelligent, not devoid of self-control. Especially beautiful were her eyes, which looked honest. I should have married much sooner. Seeing him settle down was much more pleasant, because even to Carcel there was no choice but to fall in love. The Lord himself sounded as if he was denying it, for he did not understand the reasons why the captain spoke in such a manner. As it turned out, it was clear from the stupid expression on the lover's face. Leaving the old man, Carcel assumed that his condition was serious enough. He declined Maria's offer to hire a carriage for him because he wanted to escape from it. In fact, the man had spent his time to considerable advantage. Something did catch the attention of both him and his wife, though. Unexpectedly, Raoul was assigned to follow the lieutenant, and it was the heroine who had asked him to do so. She smiled, though. To the servant, it looked like an attack of jealousy, which Inez didn't even hide. Signoria Maria is certainly beautiful, but that's not enough to be jealous of. While the valet would take orders, the mistress would shop for dresses with Miss Acevedo. So something interesting for Carcel presented itself in the person of Raoul, who was supposed to accompany Inez. It became clear to him that the latter was following him secretly. Still, he was quite proud of being Inez's loyal dog. It was somewhat presumptuous, but he could be expected to do something like that. Raoul could have done something like this even without Inez's knowledge. She would rather watch her spouse than smile like that, whether she was jealous, doubtful, angry, or nagging him. Carcel was filled with trepidation at the mere thought of it. Meanwhile, Señorita Acevedo had Inez waiting for them, who had gone in search of their missing coachman, and she was filled with dread. Inez was in a jewelry shop. She was gazing intently behind the glass at an object the owner showed her closer. It was a peridot pendant. It was usually mistaken for a brooch, so Inez had a trained eye. Embossed beneath the double cross were the initials V.O. Valinda Olivares. This pendant was given to her by her grandmother. In her past life, the protagonist had given the object to him, to the one who, because of his filthy greed, dared to desecrate her body. In her eyes, he was quite good looking, and if he just kept quiet, he would be perfect. To him, the girl was like a dream come true. Everything was different from what Inez knew. No one had ever said anything like that to her, and even Oscar's words turned to fear. She hadn't given the pendant to silence Emiliano. Even if he told someone, no one would believe it. It's just from the heart. It's proof of the feeling she has. The pendant was the color of her eyes. However, after living through harsh times, the man had to sell it. An ordinary commoner who made her life difficult. Her life had become like this because of him. Emiliano regretted ruining his beloved, for it was the very first gift she had ever given him. Still, things turned out even worse, because betrayal of the crown prince is a grave sin. Fortunately, the empress granted forgiveness to the protagonist and was going to choose another party for her. Their vow was false. Ace found a pendant in her new life, the same one that she, who had never met Emiliano, had inherited from her grandmother. So where did the other one come from? The protagonist begged that he wouldn't remember her. And when the lady saddled a horse, it surprised even Raoul. And yet, this strange thing seemed so even as he studied it again. Inez's black hair and green eyes. Then, 3 years ago, the man who had handed it to the shopkeeper had described the right woman in just that way. As the description said, her beauty would not be called unearthly, but she was definitely beautiful in a special way. She even recognized the pendant. Should the man send the letter as promised? But could that man be related to a señorita of such a noble house? And her dress was made of very expensive fabric, even if it was a forbidden passion. Just thinking about the noble status of this woman made it obvious that nothing good was going to come of it. In addition, 2 hours ago, when the lady left the shop, she seemed to run away, very strange. And now Inez returned, wanting to buy a pendant. As it turned out, the piece already had an owner. The buyer said he wouldn't be able to come for it for a while. The man was paid to store it, and the buyer wanted to put it on display. Inez offered to double the price to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. She seemed so aggressive, yet the owner continued to stand her ground and asked for the stranger's first and last name. Valinda Olivares. The family belonged to the Grandes de Ortega. If they were to be known to the buyer, however, Inez wanted to know about it. However, it was not about the heroine because she was an Escalante. Now then the shopkeeper became tense. A member of the war hero's family stood before her. She had appeared, just as he said. After a while, Ines returned, having met Raoul and being in a rather strange state of mind. And why was she interested in the current state of affairs of the artists, though she was even breathing with difficulty? Moreover, the girl started to ask about Emiliano. Raoul didn't listen to her, so she irritably started to shout. He frighteningly muttered that the letter said that they were working on restoring the murals in the Cathedral of Vivallo. So, that's where the guy was. It's a long process that could take up to 10 years. Since Emiliano caught the Archbishop's eye, he'll be locked up in Vivallo for at least a few years. And if it was him in the shop then, the letter would not get delivered initially. A life as an artist, a fine house, a good wife, all of which Ines was going to give him. However, he couldn't do that to her, or is God playing with her? The first and second lives were united by the fact that she dared to commit suicide. No matter how much Ines pondered, first as a 16-year-old and then as a 6-year-old, it was the only reason she was brought back to life. Like a punishment. But isn't that what punishment is, doing the same thing over and over again? Now she wanted to be alone. At the age of 7, after her grandmother left, the girl inherited the again pendant. And that's why only this pendant was real, because it had never been passed down to anyone. But maybe this person thought Ines would get there a little earlier? What if he remembered her? Then Emiliano never died and they never loved. There was nothing easier than to find him and face him again. Yet she had no desire to be reborn again, nor to open her eyes in this shocked world, only to die again one day. And only Carcel saw her suffering. Everyone on the estate was concerned about their mistress's condition. Everyone knew, no matter what mood she was in, no matter how she felt, Ines was not the sort to ask to be left alone. Had Carcel not entered the room at that moment, the consequences would have been dire. As Alfonso pointed out, Raoul had remained calm from the start, as if he had expected such an outcome. Even when Captain Meso asked about the symptoms, he answered immediately. When it was suggested that the Senora had had an attack before, the lieutenant did not listen and tried to kill the valet, but Raoul seemed prepared for that. He even said that with emergency care, the symptoms had been relieved. Which means this has happened more than once. The situation with the Acevedo family was also a bit strange. The carriage was said to have returned without its owner, and the Lady Acevedo, who had accompanied the Senora, was still not at home. Moreover, Alfonso then learned for the first time that Lady Ines could ride. In fact, it was even easy for her, so it was strange that Raoul did not know about it until now. However, he had the feeling that instead of Lady Ines, it was a stranger. It was as if she were from another world. No matter how hard Raoul worked for her, sometimes he felt that Ines was not here. The fainting spell, the sudden departure. There was clearly something more behind it. Something that wasn't the first time it had happened. Something that had its roots in the past. The doctor had held and questioned the gentleman's servant for 2 hours, and in the meantime had slipped his wife 4 unknown medicines already, without ever identifying the cause. Based on what he had heard, he considered the symptoms not serious, so the most accurate assessment would be made later if possible. Except that Carcel was making him disappear as soon as possible. The worst was over, so it was time to call a decent healer. Meso, on the other hand, was mentally berating Carcel, to whom he had lost all the money he had bet for 2 years. He assumed that Ines was naturally weak, or had been subjected to excessive strain. Maybe the problem was weak lungs or a weak heart. And this made Carcel angry, because his spouse was almost dead. Raoul, on the other hand, thought that neither Captain Meso nor any other exemplary doctor would prove unable to correctly diagnose the lady, although there was nothing categorically wrong with the captain's actions. He did his best. Escalante admitted that he was aware that it was not he who had bailed Ines out, but the vial in the servant's pocket, As it turned out, the señorita did not drink it on a regular basis, but only in extreme cases. And she had been in need of it since she was 16 years old. Carcel remembered that it was about that time that everything had suddenly changed. The girl did not want to see him, stopped attending all the minimum events. That was the year in which the love letters and gifts simply vanished into oblivion. It was as if Ines had been waiting for their relationship to seem particularly close to him, so that she could then immediately distance herself from him. At the time, Carcel thought he was about to give a life-changing answer in the cathedral, saying that he could accept her feelings, even if not with the same ardor with which she loved him, though the boy hoped he could make her laugh. And then he saw something that shattered his immature teenage pride. Her facial expression, which seemed to look not at a man, but at an annoying child. Being 15 or 16, old Carcel had been thinking about getting married and had tried to get her attention with every delusional idea he could think of. Little moments when he would unilaterally set aside his pride, days when he would hang around Perez just to see her face for a moment. The pathetic day when he'd flirted angrily with a girl he wasn't interested in, only wanting to get at least a little of her attention. A day he regretted. A day that had turned his life upside down the first time he'd slept with a woman. Carcel believed she was the one who hadn't made the effort. It was Ines who no longer bestowed even a glance on him. It was she who actually didn't like him at all. He was the one who had feelings. The following year, Escalante, like a beaten dog, went to the military academy. Dreamed of becoming an officer since childhood, although everyone thought that Carcel was running away from the wedding. What could he care about a bride who paid no attention to him? Throwing away all hopes and interest in her, he finally found freedom. However, he was told she was ill. They said she couldn't eat, sleep, breathe. Such was her life then, while he wandered and ran away. Of course, she officially had a weak heart. However, the point was different. At the time, Lady had never even gotten out of bed for a single day. Could things have turned out somewhat differently if Carcel had only known about her pain and not run away? Again he pondered, as if he did not love. Now, however, the man was okay with it being love. He begged her to wake up and lavish his gaze on her, wanting to hear her voice again. By the way, Ines hadn't liked babies from the beginning, and pregnancy seemed like something vile. Only she'd done a terrible thing to her own. Maybe his death was a foregone conclusion. All the children she had carried in her womb had never managed to come into the world. Only their lives had been taken by him. But not Luca. This baby was carefree traveling through an unfamiliar city, lost and frightened his mother. But there's no going back. She thought she would have breathed a sigh of relief not finding him alive, for he would not have to grow up in a world like this. Holding on to a man she had never met in this life, she thought she had found happiness. This is a dream, and she is out of her mind. Opening her eyes, Ines wished she could say something to Señorita Acevedo, until suddenly her attention was caught by a tired-looking Carcel. He was displeased, for after the commotion his spouse had made, he remembered a stranger. They were warming up in the carriage. It all happened just as the lady went to look for her. Escalante inquired about what had happened, touching Ines gently. It brought her back to the day she had fallen asleep in tears after being beaten by her mother, the day her nanny had been kicked out, the day she had been sick alone. Perhaps she had felt something like that only with young Luciano. But Carcel was nothing like him. The reality she had sought in her dream for so long was not so impressive upon awakening. The dream was over, and Ines had survived. But even now, the heroine wished that the shopkeeper would forget about everything. She confessed to her spouse that she had been looking at the jewelry for a while and got carried away, and then got lost in El Tabio. She managed to stop a passing carriage. From what she heard, Carcel became angry. He invited her to eat her breakfast, and for the first time, a certain aristocracy appeared in him. Ines tried to butter up the subject by mentioning that it wasn't the first time. However, she didn't even know that Raul kept acquiring and carrying around that medicine because it hadn't happened to her in the last few years. If it hadn't been for him that day, the señorita might have died, and a few months before, Carcel had almost thrown him out of the estate. Her words about her own flaw had shocked the man. She blamed herself for not warning him beforehand, for he would not have been frightened. He was disgusted to hear her call her illness that. Now, Ines thought, he wouldn't have to hear her father curse her. Her mother had called her own daughter a defective product, which brought tears to his eyes. He was afraid of losing her. Carcel knew how smart this woman was. No matter what he said, all alone worthy of her laughter was nonsense. This time, however, she was wrong. The man had not considered her a thing and had seen no flaw in her. Now he felt ashamed that he had dared to raise his voice at her. It all came from the fear that she would die right in front of him. Ines had fainted as there was nothing he could do, so the man was just grateful that she was still in one piece. Still, she shouldn't have said that. How could her spouse even say that her pain would become her weakness? Carcel left before Ines could say anything. He simply left the bedroom, left his uniform, and left. She wanted to talk. After all, that was not what she had in mind. But was there such a need? It was probably the right time to distance herself. It's such a distant, sometimes annoying, unhappy child, and so... The husband returned, startling the girl. He only wondered how beautiful the jewelry was, and if she had bought anything. A little later, Ines confessed that her husband was behaving strangely. How much had Raul blabbed to him? The fellow had, after all, kept silent about some of her symptoms even in the presence of the healer. To think that the servant had chosen his words skillfully when he saw his own mistress unconscious from lack of breath. But did he behave the same way with Carcel? Whatever the formality of the mendicant's visit to the girl, her medicines were changed one after another, as Raul could say he gave her nothing, contrary to the obviousness of the contrary. It was natural for the Lord to know and worry. After all, he was her husband, except that it wasn't limited to isolated episodes before. The lieutenant had to be made aware of that as well. After all, the couple would spend the rest of their lives together. Everyone assumed that Ines had been cured in due time, but apparently that did not correspond to reality. Whether she was around or not, if something like this happened again, her husband would know her better by then, and would be able to provide the support she needed. Carcel was really worried about her. But her words that their marriage might not last made the man hesitate. The girl had no intention of showing her unsightly side to anyone during married life, whether it was breathing problems or a fall. However, she didn't just cough a few times in front of Lieutenant Ines fainted because she couldn't breathe. And that's what her spouse saw. What was next? Somehow, she wanted to know if Raul would tell about the marks from the wounds and scratches, for even the Duke had given huge sums of money to hide them. She thought the footman had been ordered to pity his mistress. He sympathized with her, so it horrified her. This decision could be very important for her marriage, for Carcel still wished to meet the doctor in person. If he took advantage of this in the future, things would be completely different and would not be limited to a simple nag about poor health, because his wife had been completely out of her mind for some time. Didis believed that Carcel would not do such a thing, but she feared not that he would run away. The girl feared whether he would not tie her up hand and foot while his sympathy for her and the confusion in her head was being fulfilled, as Raul had once done. 8 days later, Carcel was shown the jewelry on the counter. Without hesitation, he ordered it all packed. The shock was the fact that Carcel had never once had the misfortune to give a girl a present. In Calstella, he had been so reluctant to meet women that the rumors from Mendoza were beginning to seem suspicious. However, the man couldn't understand why some were opposed to giving all the jewelry to Ines. It was about the Escalante family's use of legendary gifts from centuries ago. But even so, he called it a century-old antiquity in front of his father. However, Carcel was completely ignorant of gifts as well. His friend felt it necessary in such a case to tell about the jewelry shop. And just at that time, they were closed. As a result, the Lord had no other choice but to go to the first shop that caught his eye. After an argument, he decided that he would definitely buy something. And since then, 8 days had passed, and he had turned into a fool who had done nothing. He was presented with new jewelry, even if he didn't listen to what the salesman was telling him. If you look at it that way, Carcel went there without even knowing what Inez liked. Until recently, he would not have thought that she would have been interested in jewelry. She was quite indifferent to such things. He began to go through all her images in his head and came to the conclusion that the jewelry was mostly blue, though anything would suit her. On a day when the sun's rays were reflecting off the stained glass windows, the heirloom earrings looked beautiful on her. The salesman thought that the lieutenant was in this place because of a hint from his wife. He said that the señorita had come here about a week ago. Carcel assumed that, on that day, she had meant this very place. The girl was looking at a piece of jewelry, a pendant. According to the owner, she had come in after noticing the item behind the glass, and she looked extremely interested, not even concerned about the price. But this is more of a jewelry for a devout, middle-aged woman. Inez, such a thing is to her taste, and on top of that, it's heavy. Unfortunately, the item already had an owner who was willing to put the pendant on display. Accordingly, its owner had some hidden meaning. Carcel wished to buy the item, so he asked to be informed if the owner of the pendant agreed. A similar request was made by Inez. That same evening, the heroine herself recalled her husband's words regarding the jewelry. At that time, she said that she didn't need luxury items, especially since she didn't want to throw money to the wind. Carcel agreed with her, but insisted that she at least spend his money. He was ready to pay her whatever she wanted and asked her not to worry about it. Whenever the lieutenant thought of what might have happened to her, a shiver came over him, and the fact that Inez was still in one piece made him glad. During the day, the girl met people purposefully, and at night she stayed alone with her books and rewrote the Bible. Her spouse was not yet at the estate. However, that was not a fear. As they drank water and wine, he gazed out of the window at the sea, and she read the travel notes of a foreigner. Those were evenings in which the girl simply took her place beside him. A little earlier, Inez would carry on a conversation about everyday affairs, and in the morning she would open her eyes and greet him with a smile. Everything in the marriage was like the waves of the sea. She forbade herself to experience such pleasure. Don't cry so foolishly looking for meetings with women. If he had acted as he was accustomed to, everything would have been different. The man gave her a gift, a paperweight, because her spouse had been doing a lot of rewriting lately. He marked the spot where she had left off and asked her to keep him company. It was difficult for him to bear loneliness, so the desire to be closer grew with every minute. Of course, her legs were lovely, and her steps were cute that he couldn't help but be transfixed by them. Though in her current state, walking 20 steps wasn't easy. Raoul said there was still no word from the healer who had treated her before, and if she did not mind, Carcel wished to find a physician in Mendoza, but he did not wish to confide such a matter to a servant. Escalante wished to take matters into his own hands, so that his wife would never again fall ill. In the end, after all, he did buy her so much jewelry that she brought up useless, though his puppy dog look was begging for a closer look. What did he expect, though? Everything Inez had when already used by someone. Worn items couldn't be considered a gift. It seemed kind of silly to the girl since it wasn't the first time she had heard it. One was the daughter of the Valestena family. The other was the eldest son of the Escalante family who would inherit its entire fortune. And now the two men asked between themselves. The girl didn't see any logic in her choice of jewelry, so the man asked her to simply exclude it. For her, the victorious one was considered only wasteful, so she asked her spouse not to spend her money in such a way. Still, she, as the recipient, might not like his gifts, so she asked for peace of mind. However, if she didn't like it, why did she wear it? It was something she liked after all. Carcel had hoped for a ring or other jewelry and flashed a bright smile when he heard she liked something. Inez herself, however, was embarrassed by his childish joy. In the end, she picked out what she wanted and asked for the rest back. Escalante, on the other hand, insisted on keeping the gifts because she liked to give the other girls something for some reason. Inés mentally agreed to borrow everything to return later, but still asked her spouse not to make any more impulsive purchases. Carcel could not look at her. Inés had no idea what gifts her husband had given to other girls in recent times, but these words made him feel like a scoundrel. Though what bribery could be talked about when he was watching her with such an expression on his face? The girl had warned him that he was burdening her in a similar manner. The Lord had thought she would tell him not to feed the fish he had caught, and nothing more. But even if it had been just one phrase, he would not have felt much better. As expected, she exceeded his expectations. He again allowed her to dispose of these things as she pleased, but asked her to keep the earrings, which suited her perfectly. The man ordered the rest to be thrown away, especially since there was an incinerator just over the hill. Sounds like he's crazy. Carcel bit her face and confessed that he'd never given gifts to anyone before. Now his problematic wastefulness belonged entirely to her. Even so, though, the man hoped it would make her uncomfortable. In the end, the jewelry never returned to the jewelry shop, to which the lieutenant was endlessly glad. Henceforth, he would not give anyone the rest. She wanted to keep it and then return it untouched, without even touching it. The couple arrived at the Acevedo family, who were so pleased with the gifts. They were sorely tempted to make them a family heirloom. The captain was a sailor to the core, so a ring from the admiral's grandson would be a gift to him. They treated the Escalante couple to an evening out. What good people! Inés, on the other hand, was finally able to take such a nice walk. Though at the sight of her, Carcel was amazed every time at how a man could be so weak. He should have kept his mouth shut. The man had brought her to a place that was best seen at night, though his wife had only recently learned of it, of course. She had moved here in a hurry. Carcel's father had already made plans, so the newlyweds would have a lot of traveling to do, but they could always come back to Calsdella.
She can always return to Calstelle. So the heroine has plenty of time to admire the square. She just wanted to know how long her husband would stay. According to him, Carcel could have been assigned to another place, but if Inés was happy here, he was willing to stay here. He could see that Calstella was to her heart. And if one were to believe the social prejudices about the maternal relatives of the imperial family, then they would be able to bewitch His Majesty with their speeches, practically rope him. The girl knew that her husband must strictly follow his superiors, but he was given a real right to choose. Except that she had originally meant otherwise, she still remembered several options for the future. No variables arose in the circumstances of her grandmother's death, and similarly, other deaths, including those in the Escalante family. Haynes did not wish to indulge in memories of such a thing in front of Carcel, for he was destined to lose the life he wanted anyway, and she had already ruined it with a marriage that the man had not wanted in Inés's past life, but a divorce would at least bring it back. However, as in the past, Carcel will one day leave the Navy and will no longer be a soldier. Haynes saw the man simply using his uniform as a pretty wrapper, but after spending half a month at Calstelle, Haynes changed her mind. Carcel loved the Navy, respected his grandfather, and now it was clear to the heroine what freedom he had originally wanted. He is the eldest son of Escalante, and Escalante, being the family of the Empress, is one with the Crown Prince, and this fact is irreversible. What else could he do? The hero from Insi's memoirs led a life in which there was no place for the realization of the right of inheritance, and even married, and as a result returned to his intended place behind Oscar. At any rate, that was his life, even if their marriage didn't make him the heir to the family and in this one. Now, Carcel would at least know about it, albeit in the distant future. The freedom that Nas could give him back is only to create an atmosphere of some calm, and nothing more. As a matter of fact, everything will become as in the past. However, if he had a legitimate heir, but was not bound by marriage, things would be a little easier for him. His life, in any case, will continue to flow in a different direction, regardless of any dependence on me, and therefore Ryance did not feel remorse for the fact that arrogantly dared to change his life. However, Carcel was ready to serve further, if such an arrangement would please his wife. Her opinion was important, for if he did not make her a duchess, her father would either take his daughter back or kill Escalante. The man abruptly changed the subject, wondering if Ins knew how to ride. But she considered herself awkward and had never ridden a few times in her entire life. Thanks to her words, the Lord had a desire to ride with her. However, she was already feeling better, so they could start right away. Karsel remembered the story of the mermaid on that statue. As with other local stories, the Kalstella coast had its own famous tantalizing legend. Once upon a time there were mermaids, beautiful creatures, but heartless, devoid of any emotion because feelings were unknown to them and love was unknown to them. Therefore, they lived their lives without knowing the wounds of the soul. Not trusting man, mermaids tested with these people, falling in love with them. And once serving at the Admiral Sailor rescued a mermaid thrown ashore and lost his head from her. The girl he liked wanted to put the sailor's feelings to the test as other mermaids did. The mermaid offered him to live together in the sea, so he followed her. He followed her deeper and deeper until he began to suffocate. It is easy for these creatures to forget that people cannot breathe underwater, and the foolish soldier, madly in love with the mermaid, drove himself to the point of drowning, believing that on land, he would be able to breathe again. The mermaid belatedly pulled the body of the already dead sailor onto a rock, but he plunged again and again to the seafloor, to the world of the mermaid, to which she wanted to bring him. It's a place where she could never meet him. Men are stupid after all, so thought Ins, who in Karsel's eyes had not tested him, had not longed for his love, had not wanted to know him, had not asked him to leave with her. She had done nothing wrong, nothing that mermaids did, but the sailor had loved the mermaid to such an extent that he had died plunging into the abyss of the sea. Ins resembled her, apparently because Karsel loved her, so much so that he didn't mind drowning while following her. So much so that he didn't even know how to breathe. The man loved sometimes in such a stupid, oddly stupid way, and it seemed to him that just as the mermaid did not love the soldier, she did not love him either. Escalante felt that his wife would not love him to the very end. But this image would be with him forever, so even if he drowns, it will be fine. The servant reported that no matter how hard he tried, no significant clues could be found. Disease was a weakness of aristocrats, and Inés was Valenciana's only daughter. According to the maids, dozens of doctors came to the señorita, and not only from Mendoza itself, half of them were foreigners. Without doing anything, they ran away. Perhaps they had failed almost immediately. Which meant that his next words were hardly to be taken on faith. It was as if Inés's affliction was a mental illness. After a short walk to the stables, Inés returned in parade attire, for she was not allowed to use either carriage or horse, for Karsel had bribed Mario. And now Arandra only had to make a similar facial expression to interrogate the Karsel. Ins told her husband about her plans, but he just smiled shamelessly and wished her luck, and he did so because the señorita's temperature had risen a little. The maid was shocked because she was worried about her mistress. She remembered how she had returned in light clothes after her walk with the lieutenant, but she was not cold at all. Arandra was about to call a tailor. It seemed that Karsel's habits were rapidly being adopted by everyone on the estate. Now everyone here was watching the main character's every move, worrying how she would not fall ill from a single sneeze. They showed such care and attention that she had never felt in her past lives. Apparently, when Inés had passed out, her appearance had left a lot to be desired. Unlike the prim, rule-bound people of Perez, the people here were relaxed and sincere. So their concern was mostly unpretentious and expressed in a gruff manner. Had she ever lived in an environment of such unbridled sincerity? She could tolerate it once, but if it continued day after day, it would be difficult. Karsel, being a solid person, looked completely lost. Even Arandra's heart trembled. Here was the lieutenant who still couldn't calm down. The woman hinted that the señorita didn't have to leave while her husband was bothering her with his worries, because it was possible to call people here. But her words made Ins wonder why she had been waiting for the right opportunity, until now. From that day on, the señorita found herself absorbed in all sorts of social events. She was visited by elderly married ladies, young spouses of junior officers, wives and daughters of the lesser-known local nobility. There were also rich commoners and businessmen's daughters, who set themselves a variety of goals, from establishing their first connections in these circles and ending with gaining new ones through the existing ones. There were also those who intended to catch Karsel's eye as if by chance. However, the doors of the manor were open to guests almost every day, and the eyes of the servants even shone with the anticipation of a new job. In any case, it is no exaggeration to say that thanks to the señorita, the hilltop of Logorno was completely transformed almost in one sitting and became the center of social life in Kalstella. Compared to the life of a princess, things were now extremely simple. In Mendoza, where every word spoken by the interlocutor was carefully weighed, no effort was required, for there the psychological warfare was as clear as day and even cute. But there was no prey as delicious as the precious first and last name of Ines Escalante. Unlike that time, though, the protagonist now has to pretend to be a good senora. She taught the ladies to write beautifully, for handwriting is one of the initial knowledge of aristocrats. But here they must have lacked the opportunity to learn clean writing. Some of them even understood why they were ridiculed by their own husband. Now even jokes would begin to seem like something serious. There was a question. Did Senora Munoz and Senora Atura receive invitations? Leah, Jose's wife, assumed that they had been sent to everyone whose husbands in Calstella were involved in organizing the deliveries. However, this was not true. The women didn't even show up for the last gala dinner, so they were obviously forbidden to come here by their husbands. In Mendoza, they have legal wives, but they escorted innocent senoritas with them to their place of work, presenting them as their wives. They were forbidden to meet the other wives, because the husbands feared the truth would be revealed. Ines knew that in this world, non-interference in the affairs of other families was a sign of nobility. If such a case became public, it would cause great consternation. By the way, Oscar had a habit of meticulously going through every single article in the newspaper. So the first thing to do now is to ask those ladies. If the poor ladies didn't know about anything, then they'd have the hardest time. So Ines agreed to let them know that life was definitely not ending there, because the solution could be divorce. Fires and vouch for them as their future selves, they would gain more respect than they had when they were married to those who were good for nothing. But even with a letter signed by the Senora, they would have nowhere to go. Queens didn't even know them by sight. She believed that whether it was finding a worthy partner to remarry or becoming a governess would seem like a new horizon. If they wanted to start a new family, that would be that. If they wanted to work, the ladies would offer them a place in a good family. Living life solely as someone's partner and not knowing exactly about anything, they only waste their time. If they are not short of money, you can help them buy land. But now they suddenly wanted to acquire it too. Ines joked that ladies should not abandon their husbands, but some wanted Munoz to become a lowlife without a single coin in his pocket. By the way, Lady Salvatore clearly liked the idea. Not long ago, she had gotten drunk and intended to strangle her husband, who was also drunk. With the help of the heroine, she managed to meet with a reputable lawyer, and now the preparation of the case was underway. According to Kersel, Lieutenant Salvatore whined every day in front of anyone that he had no money. But if the seniors didn't want publicity, they would have to be understanding, for their wishes were paramount. The laughter of the ladies could be heard even outside the front door, which made Kersel curious. His appearance, he attracted everyone's attention, but the kiss went to the only one. While there was a silent squeal in the room, the couple exchanged phrases as if no one else was there. But soon they did. What Ines regretted was that she had not hired a maid of honor at Kersel's insistence, for now she had to change her clothes herself. She liked the color of her dress because it felt like she was returning to her homeland. She just wanted to look strong and healthy in it. Kersel showed up just in time to notice that she was late changing her clothes that day. This led the heroine to think that the man knew when Ines changed her clothes on other days, and there are many eyes on the estate as she buttoned up all the buttons like that, including those around her neck. The lieutenant imagined unbuttoning them, one by one. These words pricked Ines, especially when Kersel said the thought of taking off his spouse that dress, which had visited him and thus brought some trepidation even now. Had she made a mistake when she decided to change into this outfit? The man's hands began to explore his mistress's body, and the lieutenant noticed that his wife's forces had slightly increased in size. Ines blamed it on him, though, because he'd made her eat more because of her fainting spell. He had even dreamed that she was pregnant. Of course, it was wrong. So Kersel expressed a desire to try harder rather than sleep together more often. She didn't want to overdo it. No matter how many times Ines had mentioned that she wasn't in any pain, the hero continued to show excessive concern for her. He couldn't ignore such a response. By the way, the couple hadn't done it in 6 days, so it was indeed time. It seems that Kersel had returned time after time to the dilemma of whether to do his duty or to take care of his wife. For some time, he did not allow himself to lay a finger on Ines, and finally, when she could not bear it, she attacked him herself. For they have no time to be idle. If they had a whole life together ahead of them, Ines wouldn't give it much thought. Ines woke up at 5:30. Carcel showered her with compliments. She was so nice that it could have gotten him killed. In fact, that's what Nes wished for him. Still, after the events of the previous night, it seemed unusual. Then the man hadn't even taken her like he should have. At least not in the literal sense of the word. Was it because of the emerging feeling that the more tired Nes was, the more alert he was? Of course, the protagonist knew that Carcel was doing all this for her. The girl would send him downstairs and eat, and he would refuse because he was tiring her out. Which, by the way, she disagreed with. It was not that she needed entertainment as such, for the arrival of an heir was the responsibility of the couple, just as meeting each other's needs was a kind of responsibility. That was so, she had nothing to say. Carcel was mesmerized by her cute appearance as the girl mumbled with her mouth full. He clearly had something wrong with his eyesight. Ines considered herself unworthy of such treatment. She'd shared a cup with him as if nothing had happened, and now she sat on his bed and practically ate from his spoon. And trying to avoid his overprotective behavior was even harder. And she knew this look of men, whether it was simply from the influence of the moment, or from devotion, or from a kind of jealousy because of the impossibility of knowing her better against her hopes. Even for a brief moment, Carcel looked at her with a look like that. There can be no doubt about it, that's the look of a man in love, and that's a problem, and Ines wondered why he liked her. Passing to the opinion that sometimes men succumb to the influence of their moods. She was doing a pretty good job of convincing herself that this was not the case, as in her previous life. It was impossible to control everything from the beginning to the end, and because of his overprotection, Ines even gained weight. Once the child is born, it is all over. How quickly have men in love, who seem to lose the last vestiges of pride in their feelings, betrayed their wives as soon as they became pregnant? Among all the men known to the protagonist, Emiliano is the only one who has not betrayed his pregnant wife. Perfect face, innate abilities, wealth. There it was, the image of a man who possessed so much that it was difficult to say what he lacked. Even if Carcel didn't want to betray, he had everything he needed to do so. One day, he will meet again a woman for whom he will want to be as gentle as he once was for Ines. Her musings were interrupted by Arandra, who had returned from the second floor. She had found the children's portraits of their masters, which she wished to hang by the stairs instead of in the hallway. The servants liked Inez's sullen face, though she tried to exude genuine anger. The woman decided that the little girl did not like the clothes she was dressed up in. But there was no exact answer. The heroine expressed a desire to hang only a portrait of her spouse, but both Arandra and Alfonso refused. The portraits looked good together. Ines had been catching Alfonso's strange looks lately, and his manner of speech was odd, so she assumed he had heard something from her conversation with Raul. Maybe Carcel just doesn't like thin women, by the way. After the symptoms disappeared, Raul still saw a doctor from Peril once a year to get a cure, but he is a very secretive person. Suddenly arranging a secret meeting is not an easy task. He could not even determine where he lived. According to the healer's informant, there was a high-profile incident involving the Peril royal family. The sick man was killed. Raul also had questions and with them similar suspicions. It seemed obvious that a certain noble had died during treatment, but it was impossible to find out whether there had been negligence on the part of the doctor. Nevertheless, based on what he heard, he was sentenced to death for first-degree murder. But the chancellor stopped the trial at the last moment, and even though the king ordered the execution on the spot, the healer managed to survive thanks to the patronage of other members of the monarch's family. There were many people who wanted to repay him. It was rumored that some of the king's army was even mobilized several times to stop the king. So regardless of whether the family member's illness was already cured or still needed continued treatment, for the future it was more beneficial to keep the doctor alive. Only later it was discovered that the deceased patient was a prince who was not even 6 months old. The emperor objected to the measures necessary for treatment, which led to the child's death, but it seems that the incident was made out to be a medical error. That is why the healer has been hiding for almost 10 years, and it is necessary to somehow get an answer from him in advance, so as not to travel in vain. The Kingdom of Paral is a small country located in the interior of the continent. Even if you take the sea route from Ortega, you will have to cross the border twice, otherwise 1 or 2 months will be wasted. The best option would be to seek asylum in another country. But these guys are unusually suspicious. A man who doesn't trust a single soul can't settle anywhere anyway. He'll just keep moving from place to place. What did the Duke of Valesena do? He said that no other doctor had ever succeeded in improving Ines's condition. The Duke offered him everything. And by the title, and grant the fiefdom of the duchy, even soldiers, so that the king's army would not reach him. Then the duke pleaded, but all in vain. The doctor said he must die where he was born, in the very land where he lives, hiding like a rat, not even knowing when he will meet death. He said that he hated seeing only nobles to the point of trembling, even refusing to treat mistress and choose as soon as he found out her status, only agreeing in the end out of interest in a rare disease. Raoul traced in Carcel some resemblance to the duke. He felt that murderous aura. Soon after the Sonora was better, the symptoms ceased to appear, and it was no longer necessary to kill him. His grace was so happy that he was almost confused. However, this was not a cure. Raoul was ready for it to happen again. On the eve of the day of his departure, the Paralian doctor quipped that he had never been able to cure the disease, so the prescription only temporarily alleviated the symptoms. He said that he did not know the cause of the disease, nor on what basis the patient's condition had suddenly improved, and therefore, in emergency cases, medicine might be required. The healer did not want to bear the extra responsibility for a woman who might die suddenly. It was unlikely that the Duke had consulted all the doctors in the world, so it would be necessary to look for more, and of course to bring the Paralian doctor back to Calstella. Raoul was going to keep sending letters. However, this was the first time he had not received a response for such a long period of time. The Duke should never have let him go in the first place. The medicine he had was insufficient from the start, so the healer had to stay where Ines was, at Perez. Marcel noted that should have kept him at her feet for the rest of his life, even if they had to make him a cripple. Means heard it too, including the words about when the unknown could suddenly die. That's why the guy knew about everything in advance. The hero was sick of pathetic excuses, thanks to his lieutenants, and was already sick of what was happening. Instead of Raoul, Esposa's men would take care of the visit. To Perel, however, the matter had to be handled secretly. Fortunately, it was Carcel's men, not his father's, so there was no need to worry. Mrs. Innocine said that her life was not cheapened by whether someone was responsible for it, particularly a man like her spouse. If she pushed him in the back, would Carcel retain the confidence that he would still be alive after 5 minutes if he walked down the stairs? He didn't even have anything to say to that. The heroine didn't listen for a second to the conclusion he made, as if it was something that only she alone knew about. The gentleman simply said that everything had its turn. She was perfectly fine, as if nothing had happened at all. Still, it seemed strange. Raoul was worried that what had happened would only make the disease worse, but the attacks, which used to occur several times a day, had subsided, so there was no need for undue haste, for they still had quite a bit of effective sedative left. At that moment, Alfonso entered the study. He had no intention of eavesdropping and wanted to leave quietly, but he was too clumsy. Carcel asked him to stay, for the butler was still in secret communication with the doctors. They said consumption was the hardest to recognize. The most famous doctors had already visited Perez. To begin with, Mateo from Espasa will arrive tomorrow afternoon, bypassing Mendoza. They talked for a long time, until Raul and Alfonso were alone. The former thought that the other was uncomfortable, for he could not understand the reason for this sudden change in his attitude. Alfonso called him an abomination. He was unhappy that the Valestina family had done so much that it was frightening to expect anything more. Unlike Raul, the man did not resemble a barking dog. But since when did the Escalantes engage in deceit? And there's no undoing what's been done. The senorita lied, as if she knew nothing, and continued to act like the mistress of the house, while the lieutenant was charmed by her like a boy. It was unlikely that he would even pretend to hear him, even if he told him the truth. Fortunately, Raul was not much touched in this wilderness, and so he had learned some literacy during his life. But it seemed impossible for him to go around and around as the gentlemen from Mendoza do, so he decided to say it directly. When comparing people to barking dogs, you also need to be prepared for the fact that these same dogs can bite. And of course, take your age into account. Alfonso had no intention now of explaining how much he respected the seigneur. But if he was deceiving even those he respected, Raul would not even call him a dog. He had the expression of a person with severe misophobia. But as a result, he can't even say anything out loud. It's about what? That the unfortunate young lady with the unknown consumption is really just a madwoman. That, however great the surname bestowed upon the senorita at birth, she has a defect which the companion of the eldest son of Escalante is not supposed to have. Even if Raul admitted to the Duke that there was some flaw, even a plea for marriage would not be enough. It was so extreme that Alfonso would have fainted and lost his breath. If the Duke of Escalante had known, he would have sent her to a convent to live out the rest of her life. the marriage between the two families and was defined by a contract, which had to be strictly observed, as well as the conditions of being in the Grandes de Ortega. And yet, the Valestena family put the sick daughter, who was passed off as healthy, on the scales and made a deal. And so even if the marriage is unilaterally dissolved, Raoul interrupted the man, saying that he came from an influential family. He had parents in his life, books and clothes at the right time. In other words, he had never experienced deprivation. The boy, on the other hand, was originally different from people like him. Everything the butler took for granted Mrs. Innes gave him a name and food, taught him how to write, and everything else his parents and teachers could teach him. Saved an orphan child dying in the streets. No crazy person could care for others so much. Inés was a child herself then, but to Raoul she was no different from God. Alfonso wasn't even worth a speck of dust on her shoulder, and since he was eavesdropping like a rat, it was worth noting that if Raoul decided to punish him right now, the butler would die. But so, we look forward to your comments about this story. To not miss new videos, please subscribe to notifications. Thanks for watching.